Huey needed to make plenty of decisions, as his ambitious programs had depleted the state treasury. A modern highway system, 100 new bridges, new schools, free textbooks, free reading classes for 175,000 illiterates, state charity hospitals doubled in size, a new governor's mansion, a new state capitol, and thousands of extra state workers to swell the patronage ranks had drained the state during the worst of the Depression. During 1931 alone, Huey spent $79 million, just $2 million less than Governor Parker spent in 4 years, and pushed the state debt from $11 million to over $100 million. He financed many of his expensive building projects by selling bonds, which forced the state deeper into debt. The deficit stimulated the economy and created jobs during the Depression, but Louisiana's credit rating eventually fell so low that state-issued bonds no longer could be sold. Huey's financial extravagance already had caused a rift within his cabinet. H.B. Connor, the state treasurer, had tried for 4 years to keep Huey within the law and sound economics. After Connor refused to borrow funds irresponsibly from the Board of Liquidation, Huey banned the treasurer from his political camp. "You'll never get a job in this state as long as I'm alive," he threatened. Connor, a sharp, popular accountant, left office in 1932 and soon was hired by a Louisiana accounting firm. Within a few days, Huey's henchmen visited the firm and ordered Connor's new boss to fire that son of a bitch, or you would not get any business. After getting 5 jobs and being fired from each of them shortly thereafter, Connor left his family in Baton Rouge and moved to Atlanta to take a federal job. So our guy Huey, he can hold a grudge, that's for sure. Now needing new sources of revenue, Huey ignored the economic and political consequences and ordered a series of new taxes to be levied upon the people of Louisiana. When the legislature convened on May 12, 1932 for its regular 60-day session, he instructed Governor Allen to propose a constitutional amendment that would create the state's first income tax. Incomes over $2,000 a year would be taxed at 1%. Even the income tax would not generate enough revenue, however, and Huey looked to other sources to pay for road and bridge bonds and salaries for new state employees. He ordered another amendment that increased sales tax on cigarettes, gasoline, soft drinks, dairy products, chain stores, and business franchises. He also drafted a tax on insurance premiums collected in the state, a tax on electric power companies, and a franchise tax on all corporations. As legislators worked through the bills, Huey stood nervously in the back of the House eating peanuts. When the vote started, he moved along the seats, tapping the men, telling them how to vote. Huey's opponents held an anti-tax rally in Baton Rouge at the old state capitol on June 13th. Many protesters came armed. As expected, he called his own citizens' rally and ordered the New Orleans Ring to send 21 railroad cars filled with state and city employees. Both sides poured into the legislature to speak their piece. At the anti-tax rally that night, the irrepressible Mr. Pleasant joined a chorus of anti-longs attacking Huey's tax package. Their pleas fell on deaf ears as the Louisiana Senate passed all the tax bills, with only 5 senators voting against them. Not all of Huey's bills embraced new taxes. One of them spewed outright revenge. Huey was not satisfied when O.K. Allen soundly defeated Dudley LeBlanc in the race for governor and continued his crusade to completely crush his enemy. Huey had shown his intense vindictiveness before. His harassment of Paul Sierre did not end until the lieutenant governor was gone from office, and his order to have John Bangtail Sullivan banished from New Orleans politics revealed his lust for vengeance. His dislike of Dudley, however, was much more intense and personal. Huey intended to ruin LeBlanc, not only politically but professionally as well. Dudley, who described himself as the Huey P. Long of Southwest Louisiana, touched an unusually nasty nerve in Huey. On June 7, 1932, Huey introduced a bill that strictly regulated the burial insurance industry and abolished benevolent and corporative associations. Each legislator realized that the bill had one purpose: to destroy Dudley's benevolent association and one of the more successful burial insurance enterprises in the state. Huey called Dudley's business the crookedest scheme in Louisiana. The bill to destroy Dudley at first backfired. While Huey was in Chicago attending the Democratic National Convention, his enemies in both houses challenged the attack on Dudley. Representative George Perrault, one of the few remaining Dynamite Squad members, denounced the bill outlawing burial associations as nothing more than an attempt to crucify LeBlanc, because he was politically aligned against those who controlled the politics of the state. Representative D.F. Edwards, who originally promised Allen that he would vote to destroy Dudley's business, changed his mind after reading the bill. "I'm going to be first of all a man and not a monkey," Edwards announced, "and am going to vote against it." Representative Joe Hamilton fought Huey's bill so viciously that back in Jeanerette, Dr. Sierre named his two fighting gamecocks Hamilton and Huey P. Long, and claimed to put gloves on the roosters' spurs to keep Hamilton from killing Huey P. Long. On June 23rd, as representatives debated the LeBlanc bill, a fistfight erupted between two of Huey's supporters. One of them, Representative William Pegas, voted for postponement and asked his colleagues, "Because a man is defeated politically, do you want to go and cut his head off?" A fellow Longite, David Cole, jumped up and accused William of straddling the bill. The two men grappled in the middle of the floor. William's shirt was ripped open and his chest bared. Both men came away with scrapes and bruises. The next day, the representative, Horace Wilkinson, jokingly proposed that all spectators to the House proceedings be charged a quarter for admission to view the amusements from the gallery. Meanwhile, one of Huey's bodyguards, Louis Jones, assaulted Dudley's bodyguard, Joseph Bordeaux, in the marble lobby of the state capitol. Bordeaux had threatened to beat up Huey and vowed to black both his eyes before he went back to Senate. Jones, a short, muscular man, known to be as deadly as a rattler, grabbed Bordeaux and dragged him outside of the Capitol steps. Jones claimed Bordeaux pulled a pistol. "I beat him to it with mine and knocked the hell out of him," Jones recalled. He pistol-whipped Bordeaux and fractured his skull. A judge convicted Jones of attempted murder and sentenced him to prison. On Huey's orders, Governor Allen immediately pardoned Jones and later made him assistant superintendent of the State Highway Patrol. That's what I'm talking about, Huey. This is how you go to war with this system, by any means necessary, and then showing loyalty to your people, too. This is how a real populist figure gets down. It has to be dirty. It's going to get bloody sometimes. But what comes out of it, the people always appreciate it. Improvement for the populace. And once again, one can see that through what Huey created in his short time in power. The House voted to postpone the LeBlanc bill, but the next day Huey returned from Chicago Convention, entered the chamber, affirming command, and marched up and down the aisle, whittling legislators. The resistance melted, and his bill passed, 62 to 28. So, I mean, this is the big importance he has as he comes in there and puts his weight down. He goes from stalling out, not getting passed. They're fighting in the legislature. The bodyguards are beating the hell out of each other with pistols. And all he does is come back, start leaning on some people, and it gets a 62 to 28 vote. I mean, this is how you apply pressure. This is how you put these, pencil neck Poindexters, these people who grew up let's remember, Huey's a poor kid here who was all about the grind and the hustle, and he grew up like that, whether he was door-to-door salesman, whether he was flying through law school. So when you have someone like that, and then you have a bunch of these, petty bourgeois, a bunch of these Ivy League school people, a bunch of these people who essentially grew up with silver spoons in their mouths, and they're used to really not, giving empty promises and then, getting wealthy in their government positions, in their legislator positions. Now you got this whiskey swilling, supported by the rural people. He relates to the rural people. He is their representative in office. Now you have someone like that. You see what he can do when he starts leaning on these people, when he starts making things happen, when he's either like, we're going to bribe you, beat you, coerce you, convince you, whatever we got to do, you're going to vote our way, and we're going to get done what we wanted to get done, what we promised the people. And if you're my enemy, I'm going to crush you. I'm going to crush you. And if you're on my side, I'm going to show you loyalty. Earlier, across the hall in the Senate, J.Y. Sanders Jr. had led an effort that killed the LeBlanc bill. Now back in town, the iron-willed Huey reintroduced the bill and ushered it through Senate, where it passed on July 7th, the last day of the legislative session. The new vote was 31 to 3. That afternoon, Governor Allen signed the bill that put Dudley LeBlanc out of the burial insurance business in Louisiana. By 1934, LeBlanc had moved his business to Orange, Texas, just a few miles across the border. A few months before the 1932 Democratic National Convention, Huey Long traveled to New York City and stopped by the just completed Empire State Building to visit Al Smith, one of the frontrunners for the Democratic presidential nomination. Huey had already decided to support Franklin Roosevelt for the presidency, but wanted to stay on the good side of Smith. Soon after his meeting with Al Smith, Huey focused on the presidential campaign. During the busy summer of 1932, while orchestrating the senatorial elections of Hattie Caraway and John Overton, he attended the Democratic Convention as head of the Louisiana delegation. As usual, controversy was his companion. The previous February, he called a meeting of the State Democratic Central Committee, which, on his orders, re-elected him as national committeeman and selected New Orleans Mayor Walmsley as state party chairman. His enemies refused to accept the Central Committee's decision and insisted, as they did 4 years earlier, that the delegates be chosen at the state party convention. In June 1932, a week before the Chicago Convention, a rival Louisiana delegation of anti-Longs met in Shreveport and picked John Ewing, son of Colonel Robert Ewing, as national committeeman. The Shreveport delegation chose ex-governors Parker, Sanders, and Pleasant as delegates, prompting Huey to call them just a bunch of X's. In late June, all of the Louisiana delegates, including Huey's entourage and the Shreveport group of anti-Longs, headed north. Huey stumped hard for Roosevelt. Described by one Roosevelt aide as a perpetually erupting volcano, he darted up and down the aisles of the convention center, issued instructions to his followers in a roaring voice, and sparred with newspapermen and other delegates. Whenever Huey appeared, the temperature shot up several degrees, Jim Farley remembered. On 1 or 2 occasions, he narrowly missed getting into fistic encounters. Huey struggled to keep the Southerners in line, pressuring wavering delegations from Mississippi and Arkansas to stay with Roosevelt. During the 4th ballot, he stormed onto the floor and elbowed his way through the Mississippians, his reddish hair tousled and white suit soaked with sweat. He wagged a fist in Senator Pat Harrison's face and shouted, "If you break the unit rule, you son of a bitch, I'll go into Mississippi and break you." Harrison stuck with Roosevelt. Huey made the same threat to his Senate enemy Joe Robinson, the Arkansas delegate. Arkansas also held, and on the 5th ballot, Roosevelt broke his deadlock with Al Smith and John Nance Gamer and captured the nomination. Huey was pleased when Roosevelt accepted the Democratic bid for president on July 2nd, sensing that the New Yorkers shared his philosophy for distributing the nation's wealth. In an earlier campaign speech, Roosevelt had called for changes that would aid the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. In his acceptance speech, the presidential nominee called for major economic change, telling a radio audience that men and women forgotten in the political philosophy of the government for the last years look to us for guidance and for a more equitable opportunity to share in the distribution of the national wealth. Huey liked what he had heard and felt he could persuade Roosevelt to support his plan to limit the incomes of the rich. "When I was talking to Governor Roosevelt today, I felt like the Depression was over," he told a reporter. "That's a fact. I never felt so tickled in my life." Roosevelt, however, was not tickled with Huey. He feared the kingfish and the economic radicalism he spouted. The president-elect worried that if the Depression was not curtailed soon, the American people, much like those in Germany and Italy, would lose patience with the democratic process and turn to radical leaders like Huey. In normal times, Roosevelt wrote Henry Stimson, the radio and other appeals by the radicals would not be effective. However, these are not normal times, and neither are they today. The people are jumpy and ready to run after strange gods. Only a few days after the convention, Roosevelt conferred with one of his advisors, Rexford Tugwell. After they discussed the convention and the coming campaign, their conversation turned to political extremism in America. "It's all very well for us to laugh over Huey," Roosevelt said, "but actually we have to remember all the time that he really is one of the 2 most dangerous men in the country. We shall have to do something about him. The second most dangerous man, Roosevelt admitted later, was Douglas MacArthur. Huey intended to spearhead the Roosevelt campaign. During the first week of October, he traveled to New York to meet with Jim Farley and offer his services. Huey told Farley to charter a special train with loudspeakers mounted on top of the cars that would carry him on a whistle-stop tour of all 48 states. Beaming with excitement, he promised to give a dozen speeches a day and said he would offer an immediate cash payment to soldiers' bonuses. He seemed unfazed by the cost of his proposed campaign, didn't bother to inquire whether Roosevelt favored a soldier's bonus, and ignored the obvious impression that Huey Long would be at the center of the campaign, not Franklin Roosevelt. To Roosevelt's aides, Huey's campaign plan was grandiose, expensive, and completely unacceptable. Farley politely turned him down. At the time, Farley regarded Huey as somewhat a freak. On Sunday, October 9th, amidst the fall splendor of New York's Hudson Valley, Huey traveled to Hyde Park to visit Roosevelt at his estate. It was their first face-to-face meeting. Before the two men met, Huey told the press that Roosevelt had the greatest heart for mankind I've ever seen. When Eleanor Roosevelt arrived from church, she met Huey at the door and escorted him into the house. "You know, there's a striking resemblance between Miss Roosevelt and Miss Coolidge," he confided to a reporter. He was in rare kingfish form, wearing a loud plaid suit, orchid shirt, and pink necktie. At a large dinner table, he dominated the conversation and lectured the presidential candidate like a schoolboy. Roosevelt seemed amused, but his mother, Sarah, was not. The family matriarch was less than tactful when she listened to Huey's outburst at the other end of the table. "Who is that awful man?" she said in a whisper loud enough for everyone to hear, including Huey. "By God, I feel sorry for him." Huey remarked soon after leaving, "He's got more sons of bitches in his family than I got in mine." He was not impressed with Roosevelt. He's not a strong man, but he means well. Farley and other Roosevelt aides considered the Midwestern states that Huey canvassed either already lost or completely committed to Roosevelt. With little to lose, Farley did not worry about him antagonizing any voters. Soon, however, he received reports from campaign workers saying that Huey attracted enthusiastic, large receptions at all of his stops. Farley realized that Midwestern farmers, as depression-weary as their Southern counterparts, responded warmly to Huey's homespun humor, biblical quotes, and promises to redistribute the wealth. A campaign worker wired Farley, "If you have any doubtful state, send Huey Long to it." Farley admitted later that we underrated Long's ability to grip the masses with his peculiar brand of public speaking. He put on a great show. At the same time, Farley sent Walmsley to campaign in Pennsylvania, but the New Orleans mayor was ineffective and Roosevelt lost there. Later, Farley and other Roosevelt aides agreed that if they had sent Huey into the mining regions of Pennsylvania, Roosevelt could have won that key state by a comfortable margin. "We never again underrated Huey," Farley admitted. On November 30th, soon after Roosevelt won the presidential election, Huey stopped in Warm Springs, Georgia, to meet with the president-elect. The meeting between the two politicians was friendly, but Huey soon tired of Roosevelt's evasiveness. He left Georgia puzzled and dismayed by Roosevelt's lack of commitment to any notion of redistribution of wealth. "When I talk to him, he says, 'Fine, fine, fine,'" he complained afterward. But Joe Robinson goes to see him the next day, and again he says, "Fine, fine, fine." Maybe he says fine to everybody. In January 1933, Huey was back on the floor of the United States Senate, entertaining the packed galleries with rustic buffoonery, Billingsgate evangelical fervor, and, at just the right time, surprisingly shrewd common sense. To his Senate colleagues, however, he no longer was amusing. Flouting every senatorial custom and abusing the privilege of filibuster, he had become an outcast. Imagine 95 senators trying to out-talk Huey Long, Will Rogers wrote at the time. They can't get him warmed up. Huey launched crude and insulting attacks on his colleagues. When they failed to support his bills to redistribute the wealth, he gave a stern warning. "A mob is coming to hang the other 95 of you, damn scoundrels.
and I'm undecided whether to stick here with you or go out and lead them. During the 12 months he had been in Senate, Huey had become increasingly aggressive. He treated his fellow senators as if they were a shoeless rabble at a lynching. His attacks became bitterly personal. He told his colleagues they were among the unemployed and do not know it. He mimicked the speech and walk of senators he didn't like, attacked one senator for not paying his bills, and dredged up an incident from 1924 when Joe Robinson lost a fist fight with a fellow golfer at a country club. An argument on the Senate floor with Senator Pat Harrison provoked a particularly savage attack. The senator from Mississippi has another way of standing by his friends, Huey declared. Catch your friend in trouble, stab him in the back, and drink his blood. When his opponent struck back, he counterattacked even more viciously. Never touch a porcupine unless you expect to get some quills in you, he threatened one colleague. Even Alben Barkley of Kentucky, one of the Senate's most caustic wits, respected Huey's talent for razor-sharp debate. Huey defied senatorial decorum when he attacked one of the most respected members, Senator Carter Glass, a diminutive, white-haired, 75-year-old Virginian. Glass held public office since 1899, serving as a congressman for 16 years, Treasury Secretary under Woodrow Wilson, and senator since 1920. One of the Senate's experts on banking and finance, Glass marched proudly in line with other conservative Democrats. During the lame duck session in 1933, and while the Depression worsened, Glass led an effort to stem the epidemic of bank closings across the nation. He introduced a bill calling for major bank reform, including giving the Federal Reserve Board greater authority and placing national banks on parity with state banks. Glass's bill had broad conservative support, and Senate leaders expected the legislation to pass easily. Huey Long and Carter Glass, as dissimilar as two men could be, had a running feud that went back to 1928 when Glass fought the seating of Long delegates at the Houston Democratic Convention, and again in 1932 during the Chicago Convention. Glass also infuriated Huey, calling him a demagogic speech owl from the swamps of Louisiana when he opposed the Kingfish's cotton reduction plan in 1931. On the floor of the Senate, Huey sarcastically referred to Glass as our financial prophet. Now, in January 1933, Huey fought the Glass Emergency Banking Bill, arguing that the legislation favored national banks over state institutions. With the bill sure to pass, his only weapon was filibuster. When the bill reached the Senate floor on January 10th, Huey opened his harangue with a 4-hour sermon, quoting from the two Bibles sitting on his desk. Go now, ye rich men, he preached to his colleagues, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Huey, who hadn't attended church in years, proselytized his colleagues on the necessity of following the Lord's command to redistribute the wealth, referring to the Glass bill only in passing. Day after day, Huey kept going, alternating the floor with a few other senators opposing the bill. 9 days into the filibuster, Joe Robinson moved to invoke cloture and throttle Huey. The Senate defeated the motion 58-30, 2 votes short of the necessary 2/3. Republicans, delighted whenever Huey embarrassed the conservative Democrats, voted to let him and other oppositionists continue to speak. The filibuster ran for nearly 3 weeks. When it all appeared that a cloture vote to stop the filibuster finally would pass, Huey yielded and agreed to a watered-down banking bill. The Senate passed the revised Glass bill on January 26, 54-9, but it arrived at the House too late for passage and was buried in committee when the session ended. Piece of legislation that was assumed to move through Congress with ease has fallen victim, the New York Times lamented, to a man with a front of brass and lungs of leather. Carter Glass fumed. He labeled Huey's performance rhetorical rubbish and privately referred to the Kingfish as the creature who seems to have bought and stolen his way into the United States Senate. Glass's fellow senator from Virginia, Harry Byrd, asked to be assigned to a different seat on the floor so he didn't have to sit next to Huey. Even if I have to sit on the Republican side, Byrd warned Huey, you would better leave the old man alone. If you don't, he's going to shoot you. A few weeks later, Glass, still upset, was leaving the Senate with Joe Robinson. As they passed Huey at the back of the chamber, Glass stopped. "I'm tired of having him try to make a personal issue of this discussion," Glass told Robinson. Whirling about, he turned on Huey. "You damned old son of a bitch," the old man spumed. Huey, calling Glass the same name, leaped at the old senator. Robinson separated the two and ushered Glass quickly from the chamber. "I couldn't hit you," Huey yelled at the departing Glass. "You are too old a man." It was only a matter of time before Huey Long and Franklin Roosevelt parted ways. The redneck Louisianan and the partition blue blood New Yorker could never become friends or even loyal political allies, and both men knew it. Neither man trusted the other. Both were ambitious and egotistic and refused to share the spotlight with another, and by the beginning of 1933 no longer needed each other. Roosevelt had the presidency, and Huey could not use a presidential campaign to gain national exposure. Roosevelt deplored Huey's crude radicalism. "When anyone else eats with Huey, it better be with a long spoon," the president told an aide. Huey was no less critical of the president. "Roosevelt's a phony," he told a close friend. "I can outpromise him and he knows it. People will believe me and they won't believe him. His mother's watching him and she won't let him go too far. He's living on an inherited income." Over time, Huey developed an almost pathological hatred of the disabled Roosevelt. Huey believed that anyone with a physical infirmity was bad or affected in other ways. A supporter recalled, he would quote the Bible to the effect God put his mark on such people. Signs of a split between the two men began to emerge before Roosevelt took office. On January 20th, 1933, they met in Washington's Mayflower Hotel. Huey, who arrived 30 minutes late, found the presidential-elect cordial but non-committal and showing no interest in his advice. At the same time, Huey made no effort to befriend Roosevelt's close advisors. A day or two before the inauguration, he barged into a meeting on Roosevelt's associates in Raymond Molly's room in the Mayflower. Chewing viciously on an apple, Huey neglected any friendly greeting and immediately went on the attack. "I don't like you or your goddamn banker friends," he announced belligerently to the stunned group and departed the room as abruptly as he had entered. By the middle of March 1933 and shortly after the inauguration, Huey began to distance himself from the president. He vainly opposed the nomination of Henry Morgenthau as Roosevelt's Treasurer Secretary. Outwardly, Huey feigned support of the president. Quoting the Bible, Theodore Roosevelt, Daniel Webster, and William Jennings Bryan, he delivered a lengthy speech on NBC radio that implied Roosevelt supported his bills to share the wealth. In the Senate, Huey introduced 3 wealth-sharing bills. One imposed a capital levy on fortunes, beginning at 1% on $1 million of income and doubling on each additional million. A second bill limited yearly incomes to $1 million, and a third restricted individual inheritance to $5 million. He knew that if the president really supported his bills to redistribute wealth, then Roosevelt would prompt loyal Democratic senators to back him. Huey got no backing. One of his bills to appropriate $1 billion for the college education of needy students failed in the Senate 75-5. The split widened over patronage. Huey wanted control of thousands of federal jobs in Louisiana, and so did the New Orleans Ring. Federal patronage was a rich plum, including sought-after jobs such as marshals, count clerks, postmasters, and judges. In addition, the New Deal had created a new army of bureaucrats that administered unemployment relief, industrial recovery, agricultural adjustment, and other federal programs. These programs created a vast new patronage arsenal. Traditionally, the awarding of federal jobs occurred only after consulting a state senator. Soon after the inauguration, however, the president began to ignore Huey. Roosevelt knew the political value of federal jobs in depression-riddled Louisiana and dealt out the spoils of victory with shrewd precision. His political strategist, now Postmaster General Jim Farley, at first gave federal patronage jobs in Louisiana on a nonpartisan basis through the state director of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, Harry Early. Soon, though, Roosevelt administrators consulted only with anti-Long leaders like John Parker, Edward Ryder, or John Sullivan when awarding federal jobs. As expected, the jobs went exclusively to anti-longs, including Huey's estranged brother Earl, whose enmity earned him a federal job at the Homeowners Loan Corporation. See, Roosevelt now directly trying to undercut Huey's strength at his home base in Louisiana. I think it's safe to say Roosevelt was among the people who were happy that Huey Long had got assassinated, because he definitely saw him as a political rival and threat. Because Huey was a true ideologue and idealist, while Roosevelt wasn't. The federal presence in Louisiana quickly grew under the New Deal. By the end of 1933, about 326,000 Louisianans received welfare checks or had federal jobs. By 1935, FERA is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, employed 70,000 in New Orleans alone, and the Civilian Conservation Corps employed 42,000 men in the state. Huey bristled as the increasing federal influence lessened his own political power. On April 1933, he lost his patience on the Senate floor, attacking the Roosevelt administration and refused federal patronage. "So far as I'm concerned," he grumbled, "they can take all my patronage and they can keep all my patronage." Later, while in New Orleans, Huey suggested that Louisiana secede from the Union so the state would no longer be under control of the Roosevelt administration. He claimed that a bunch of Washington crats were ruining the state. "We got bureaucrats, autocrats, hobocrats, and 57 other varieties of crats out there trying not only to run the U.S. government, but sticking their noses into the affairs of individual states." In early 1933, Huey had supported some of Roosevelt's New Deal legislation, including creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the repeal of Prohibition, and several significant tax and tariff proposals. Despite his progressive rhetoric, he joined his conservative colleagues from the South when he voted against the Costigan-Wagner anti-lynching bill. Overall, he voted for about half of Roosevelt's early bills. "Whenever this administration has gone to the left, I have voted for it," he stated later, "and whenever it has gone for the right, I have voted against it." However, that spring, Huey openly broke with Roosevelt and insisted that legislation be passed to redistribute the nation's wealth. On May 12th, he failed to amend Senate revenue legislation by adding a tax on large amounts of capital. "Where is the corner grocery man?" Huey asked his colleagues from the Senate floor. "He is gone or going. The little independent business operated by middle-class people has been fading out. As a concentration of wealth grows like a snowball," now opposing even the most progressive of Roosevelt's proposals, he voted against all farm, banking, and economic recovery efforts of the New Deal, including Emergency Banking Act, Economy Act, Civilian Conservation Corps, National Industrial Recovery Act, and Agricultural Adjustment Act. So now he's to the point he's not going to vote for anything Roosevelt puts out. And it's interesting, he's talking about, even in his time, the small businesses that have disappeared and the ones that are disappearing in the future. In early June, Roosevelt introduced his National Recovery Act, which proposed bold and unprecedented measures to cope with the Depression. The controversial act suspended the antitrust laws and allowed industries to collaborate with the federal government in setting prices, production quotas, wages, and hours of labor. Huey and other rural progressives opposed the act as a sellout to big business, an encouragement for monopoly, and a grant of too much power to the federal government in regulating the economy. "Every fault of socialism is found in this bill, without one of its virtues," he argued on the Senate floor. "Every crime of monarchy is in here." His opposition made little difference, and the act passed. Huey made other futile attacks on the Roosevelt administration. Throughout the session, he favored giving a bonus and other benefits to veterans, while Roosevelt opposed the proposal as being too costly. Near the end of the session, Huey and other pro-bonus senators tacked an amendment limiting cuts in veterans' benefits onto an appropriation bill. When the bill appeared likely to pass, Roosevelt sent word to the Senate that he would veto the legislation if the veterans measure remained. Huey tried to get enough votes to override a veto, but failed to overcome the president's demand. Roosevelt watched Huey's resistance closely and in June 1933 decided to confront the Kingfish. Just before Congress adjourned, the president had Farley bring him to the White House for a morning meeting. Wearing a brilliant white-lined summer suit and a straw hat with a brightly colored band, he urged Roosevelt to yield control over federal patronage. While they met, Huey took a seat near the president's desk and removed his hat only to punctuate his point by rapping Roosevelt's paralyzed knee with it. Roosevelt, leaning back in his chair, perfectly relaxed and a smile on his face, appeared outwardly cordial, but inside had lost his patience with Huey's insolence. It did get on Franklin's nerves, remembered an aide to the president. Roosevelt listened passively, but did not yield. Exasperated, Huey tried to be upbeat to the press as he left the White House. "The president and I are never going to fall out," he told one reporter. "I'll be satisfied whichever way matters go." But Huey knew he made little progress. "What the hell's the use of coming down to see this fellow?" he muttered to Farley. "I can't win any decision over him." Later, he was more candid. "I'm never going over there again." Congress adjourned a week later. Many of Roosevelt's supporters were in good humor because of the unprecedented amount of New Deal legislation passed. Huey, still upset over Roosevelt's recalcitrance and his defeats over the National Recovery Act and veterans' bonuses, rose on the floor during the final session. "No, I will not participate in the Democratic victory tonight," he told his fellow senators. "I do not care for my share in a victory that means that the poor and the downtrodden, the blind, the helpless, the orphan, the bleeding, the wounded, the hungry, and the distressed will be the victims." Huey Long's wealth-sharing proposal to provide every American a home, an automobile, a radio, and the ordinary conveniences received little support in either the United States Senate or Roosevelt's White House. He introduced wealth-sharing legislation several times in the Senate, but never got more than 14 votes from among 96 senators. According to columnist Drew Pearson, his colleagues avoided him like a smallpox epidemic. Undaunted, Huey pressed ahead and entered his Share Our Wealth plan into the congressional record on February 5, 1934. He blamed the Depression on the failure to redistribute the wealth. So, in 1929, he argued, when the fortune holders of America grew powerful enough that 1% of the people owned nearly everything, 99% of the people owned practically nothing, not even enough to pay their debts. A collapse was at hand. Huey attacked the millionaires of the country, arguing that 1% of the people could not eat any more than any other 1%. That they could not wear much more than any other 1%, they could not live in any more houses than any other 1%. Although Washington insiders discarded Huey's plan, a vast growing number of poor Americans looked upon his promise to redistribute wealth as a workable answer to the economic ravages caused by the Depression. He appealed to large numbers of poor Americans with his plan to limit fortunes, provide a $30 pension for needy persons over 60, cut work hours to 30 a week, launch a war on disease, insanity, and drug addiction, eliminate agricultural overproduction, and give a free college education to deserving students. He rested his case on rhetoric and scripture while disregarding fiscal realities. "I never read a line of Marx or Henry George or any of them economists," he admitted. "It's all in the law of God." Critics dismiss the Share Our Wealth plan as a monstrous and tragic joke, or just another passing fad, and one of many utopian ideas that come and go like the waves of the sea, pounding loudly for a little while on the beach of public attention, and then receding to the silent depths of history. Conservatives condemned Huey's plans as recklessly confiscatory, labeling it communism dressed in populist garb and calling it his Share Our Swag program. Liberals condemned it as irrelevant since it did not touch the real source of power, namely the ownership and means of production. On February 23rd, Huey incorporated the Share Our Wealth Society and copyrighted the slogan, "Every Man a King." Launching Share Our Wealth in a nationwide radio speech, he declared that his drastic economic program was intended to hit the roof with an axe. He implored millions of his listeners to enroll with us. Share Our Wealth societies are now being organized, and people have it within their power to relieve themselves from this terrible situation. He ordered that share our wealth clubs collect no dues from members. This allowed the poor to join and kept clubs without funds because, according to Huey, most organizations are broken up by the treasurer running away with the money. Huey's national popularity soared. By the middle of 1934, he received more mail than all the other senators combined, more even than the president, and expanded his suite in the old Senate office building near Union Station to 5 rooms and employed 25 female clerks to handle the mail, including a night shift and another 14 workers. Soon after launching his Share Our Wealth clubs, he received 60,000 letters a week in his Washington office, and later, when he attacked Roosevelt in a series of radio broadcasts, more than 30,000 letters poured in daily for 24 straight days. Using his senatorial franking privileges, Huey mailed hundreds of thousands of copies of his Senate speeches to club members. Membership rose quickly. A month after he incorporated Share Our Wealth, he claimed 200,000 members. By the end of 1934, 3 million had joined, and in April 1935, he announced that 8 million people belonged to 27,000 local clubs. Huey acted as happy as a newborn father when he bragged about Share Our Wealth. It stood alone in 1 day, talked in 2 days, and began to run in 3 days, he told newspapermen on its anniversary, and now it's crying all over the length and the breadth of the United States in 1 year. Huey Long was always in motion, shuttling by train from Baton Rouge to Washington to attend Senate sessions and racing back home to ensure he kept tight control over his political machine in Louisiana. Even the seemingly tireless Huey, however, knew that he could not be everywhere at the same time and knew that he needed help in running his Share Our Wealth Society. He recognized the political value of his Share the Wealth crusade and needed a sophisticated, well-oiled operation. To manage his Share Our Wealth clubs across the country, he hired a fire-breathing clergyman, the Reverend Gerald L.K. Smith. Gerald Smith, according to H.L. Mencken, was the most gifted speaker in the nation, the gutsiest and goriest, the deadliest and damnedest orator ever heard on this or any other earth, the champion boob bumper of all epochs. Smith had preached in churches in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana, and a few months before the stock market crash of 1929 moved to Shreveport and became a minister of a large, fashionable First Christian church. Smith met Huey and asked him to save the homes of his congregates foreclosed during the Depression. Huey sponsored state legislation blocking the realty sharks and saved the homes. Smith never forgot it and became one of his most devoted followers. When Huey gave him his old suits to wear, Smith bragged to everyone where his clothes came from. Yeah, how many of your governors are going to block the realty sharks and save your home? In 1933, the 30-year-old Smith, after being forced from his Shreveport pulpit by his anti-Long congregation, became Huey's full-time national organizer of the Share Our Wealth Society. While as meek as Moses when Huey was around, Smith also nourished a dark desire for power. Tall, muscular, with wavy auburn hair and an aquiline nose, he displayed a winning smile, but his cool, clear blue eyes revealed hardness, cunning, and a bull-like ambition. He was a virulent anti-Semite who became one of the most famous hate-mongers of the 1930s. He hated Roosevelt intensely, vowing, "We're going to get that cripple out of the White House." Smith was an efficient campaigner who understood how to win people's heart. In order to succeed, a mass movement must be superficial for quick appeal, fundamental for performance, dogmatic for certainty, and practical for workability, Smith wrote. It must demonstrate its practical virtue by political success. A steam locomotive is not a pretty object. It puffs, it belches soot and cinders, it curses, it blows off steam, and it lacks the gracious attributes of refinement. But the beautiful and refined parlor car is quite helpless without it. Huey Long, whose thinking is a correct representation of the mass mind, is the locomotive whose power moves the entire Share the Wealth train, and his ego is the fire that generates the motive force of steam pressure in the boiler. After becoming the Share Our Wealth Society organizer, Smith toured Louisiana. His energy matched Huey's. His speeches were even more stirring, and according to Mencken, he was a rhetorician who was even greater than William Jennings Bryan. Smith mesmerized his audience with a mixture of profanity and scripture. He painted dramatic images of the poverty and hardship of the South during the Depression. Pull down those huge piles of gold until there should be a real job, he exhorted his audience, Bible in hand. Not a little old sow-bellied, black-eyed pea job, but a real spending money, beef steak and gravy, Chevrolet, Ford in the garage, new suit, Thomas Jefferson, Jesus Christ, red, white, and blue job for every man. Smith spoke to over 1 million people in the state during 1934 and expanded Huey's crusade into other southern states during the following year. Share our wealth spread like wildfire. While his message was secular, Smith always ended his speeches in prayer. Lift us out of this wretchedness, O Lord, out of this poverty. Lift us who stand here in slavery tonight, he preached. Rally us under this young man who came out of the woods of North Louisiana, who leads us like a Moses out of the land of bondage into a land of milk and honey, where every man is a king, but no one wears a crown. Amen. On May 13, 1934, the day before the regular session of the Louisiana legislature convened, 500 hand-picked, tough-looking men across the state arrived in Baton Rouge. They were all fierce enemies of Huey Long, and most of them came to the capital city heavily armed. Several weeks before, anti-Long politicians plotted to dismantle Huey's political machine, and they summoned the armed men in case the coming days turned violent. Huey's enemies sensed weakness in his political power after he broke with Walmsley, the old regulars, and the Roosevelt administration, and lost the New Orleans election. They planned an attack during the May legislative session that would begin while Huey was in Washington. The anti-Longs first planned to unseat Allen Ellender as Speaker and replace him with George Perrott, a Dynamite Squad member and a reliable, rotund friend of the old regulars. Next, they would remove Lieutenant Governor John Fournette by a 2/3 vote of both houses, and finally they would impeach O.K. Allen and make Perrott governor. The anti-Longs were confident they had gathered enough votes to eject Huey's men from office. As usual, Huey learned of the plot through his network of informers. Few secrets were ever safe in Baton Rouge, and his spies uncovered most of them. The kingfish can see a few things better with one eye, Haywood Brown wrote after Sands Point, than some of our politicians can see with two. Hurrying from Washington to quell the revolt, Huey strong-armed legislators and offered them the customary enticements such as patronage, favors for their parishes, even money, to change their votes and support his machine. Several fence-sitters from rural parishes stuck with Huey because they knew he still had the support of the people, especially the poor country folk who worshipped Jesus, Joseph, Mary, and Huey Long. Legislators had not forgotten that if they opposed him, they would be committing political suicide back home. During this hectic period, Huey displayed his tremendous capacity for leadership, especially in the thick of political battle, when decisiveness, quick thinking, and cool judgment counted most. Caucusing late each night in the Heidelberg Hotel with his floor leaders, he gave specific orders for his men to carry out the following day. He knew the makeup of every legislative district in the state, how many votes were cast, and who got them, and the political strengths and weaknesses of every legislator. He knew exactly which ones to target, and his efforts paid off. The vote to unseat Ellender never came to floor when the anti-Longs realized they were 3 votes short. Huey's opponents gave up, and the 500 armed men they summoned to the Capitol returned home. Huey emerged from this fight more powerful than ever, and his enemies once again were left sapped and bewildered. After crushing the attempted overthrow at the beginning of the session, an angry Huey struck back with increased vengeance. He ordered the legislature to pass a number of unprecedented bills, many of them punishing New Orleans and Walmsley, whom he removed as chairman of the state Democratic Committee. One bill denied $700,000 that the state earlier appropriated to New Orleans for road repair. Another stripped the city of its power to grant liquor license to thousands of bars and restaurants, removing a source of revenue of tens of thousands of dollars each year. Henceforth, the state supervisor of public accounts issued all liquor permits. Huey placed the New Orleans Police Department, a rich source of patronage from the old regulars, under the direct control of the state-appointed Board of Police Commissioners. He raised taxes on New Orleans Cotton Exchange, a den of linen-suited blue bloods whose members detested Huey. He pushed through the constitutional amendment that raised homestead exemptions to $2,000, but in a blow to New Orleans, omitted large cities. He lowered license fees for cheap cars and trucks, thereby depriving New Orleans of thousands of dollars more in revenue. He boasted at the time that he had taken over every board and commission in New Orleans except the community chest and the Red Cross. Huey tightened his control over the state's election machinery. He stripped parish sheriffs of custody of ballot boxes and gave it to his own state election supervisors. He no longer needed to resort to dummy candidates, as he created his own state-appointed election commissioners to replace commissioners selected by the candidates. He also ordered a bill forbidding local courts from interfering with state commissioners who removed voter fists from register offices, thereby legalizing C.S. Barnum's nighttime raid on the New Orleans voter registration office. Huey angered many legislators when he proposed a constitutional amendment to repeal the $1 poll tax. Many conservative white Louisianans looked upon this poll tax, adopted 36 years before, as a way of denying the vote to blacks and poor whites. Huey's enemies fought his proposal and at first appeared successful in denying the two-thirds vote he needed for a constitutional amendment. Huey, needing one more vote, persuaded Representative Gilbert Fortier, a New Orleans old regular and staunch anti-Long, to change his vote at the last minute and support the repeal of the poll tax. Later, Governor Allen appointed Fortier as curator of Louisiana State Museum at a salary of $5,000 a year. In November 1934, voters overwhelmingly approved the amendment, repealing the poll tax and enfranchising 300,000 poor whites who had never voted. Blacks were still without the right to vote, as the all-white Democratic primary denied them vote in Louisiana. Huey knew that when poorer white voters went to the polls, he had them firmly in his grasp. During the final days of the debate on the poll tax, he marched Representative Jesse Lucas, a railway engineer, through the chamber in greasy dungarees and carrying an oil can. "I am here in the uniform of the people," Lucas announced to his colleagues. Still needing more revenue to fund his political machine, Huey added new taxes on liquor and personal property, and indicated the personal income tax to a maximum of 6% on incomes over $50,000. He placed a tax on the huge deposits of sulfur being mined in the swamps of Plaquemines Parish, the marshy isthmus at the extreme southeastern part of the state that stuck out into the Gulf of Mexico. In a reward to Leander Perez and his Plaquemine allies, he levied the tax but then allowed the parish to take back one-third of the revenue. Huey returned to Washington confident that his new huge legislative package would pass easily. The anti-Longs, feeble when he was in town, found new courage when he left. On June 6, 1934, they held an anti-tax mass meeting in Baton Rouge, with 5 Illinois Central trains carrying more than 70 coaches filled with old regular loyalists from New Orleans. On the next day, they took the demonstration back to New Orleans, where they held a rally in the municipal auditorium. More than 1,000 attended and listened to Mayor Walmsley attack Huey and his new taxes. The rallies bolstered the courage of Huey's opponents and, with the Kingfish absent, anti-Long legislators stalled most of the tax legislation in committees. On June 21st, Huey rushed back to Baton Rouge to salvage his tax program and other legislation. Clearly, he had to be present to exert his power, for it could not be delegated to his weak-kneed supporters. When he left the state, his machine faltered and his enemies gained new footholds. After arriving in the capital, he took charge of every bill that was in question and seemingly within minutes regained complete mastery over the State House. Huey was as dominant as ever. Displeased with the handling of his tax legislation, he ordered the Speaker to remove his House floor leader and replace him with Isom Gullery, a loyal but ineffective supporter from St. Landry Parish. Gullery, a comical little Frenchman, spent most of his time prancing around the floor demanding, "The governor wants this bill. The governor wants this bill." On Monday, July 2nd, Huey held a meeting of the Ways and Means Committee on the 10th floor of the Capitol and ordered passage of the 3 major bills containing the income tax increase, the tax on New Orleans cotton exchange, and a 2% tax on receipts from newspaper advertising. He was impatient to see his tax bills passed and pushed the legislator hard. When a clerk reading the bills did not read them fast enough to suit him, he snapped at one of his leaders. Tell him to hurry up. They don't have to hear a damn thing. All they have to do is vote. During the early hours of the morning, Sunday, July 8th, some senators complained of working on the Sabbath. The Bible says if the ox gets stuck in the ditch to work Sunday, to get him out. Huey answered, ordering the senators to follow the Bible's teaching, and when the legislator is stuck in a ditch, it's up to you to work Sunday to get out. During the House debate on the tax on newspapers, anti-Long Representative Joe Hameter of Caddo Parish argued that the tax ultimately would be passed on to the public. Huey's new floor leader, Issam Gullery, asked Hameter, "Isn't it true that every tax is passed on to the consumer?" "Yes," Hameter replied. "That's exactly what I've been preaching in this legislature for the past 6 years." Seeing Gullery's question as a concession to the opponents, Huey jumped up and shouted across the House floor, "Sit down, Issam!" Gullery immediately sat down and asked no further questions, with Huey standing inside the rail, the House floor, and shouting, "Vote yes, vote yes!" The House passed the newspaper tax 56 to 36. During the session, Huey used a favorite ploy of attaching controversial and power-grabbing amendments onto routine legislation during the last minutes of the session. As the bill went smoothly through the House or the Senate, with legislators anxious to adjourn, a Long leader would rush in and propose an amendment, sometimes hundreds of pages in length. After the clerk mumbled a few sentences, the amendment bill went to vote. In one of his spite moves, Huey used this last-minute ruse to remove the entire city government of Alexandria, including the mayor and commissioner of finance, because Huey was pelted with eggs during a speech there. Huey used another legislative ploy after opponents introduced a bill prohibiting the removal of voting records from the registrar's office except by court order. More specifically, the bill would keep Huey's henchmen from doctoring registration lists, as attempted earlier by C.S. Barnes. On the night before the bill went to the floor for a vote, Huey upended the legislation, amending it to prohibit any court from ordering the removal of records from state-appointed registrar's office. When Huey's irate opponents saw the change, they tried to withdraw the bill. Huey ordered the floor leaders to refuse to allow them to withdraw, the first time such a request had been denied, and the revised bill passed. Anti-Long legislators were powerless, their angry protests dying away. Having directed the votes in the House, Huey marched across the capital of the state and grabbed his floor leader, Senator Coleman Lindsey. "Why don't you bring those 3 tax bills up and pass them?" he ordered. "That's all we want to pass." The Senate passed the 3 taxes within 20 minutes. Huey stood on the Senate secretary desk and carefully watched as the lights on the voting machines indicated how each senator had voted. On the final day of the session, July 12th, Governor Allen signed the bills authorizing the newspaper advertising tax, an income tax increase, and a tax on the New Orleans cotton exchange, taxes on liquor, chain stores, sulfur, and utilities, and the repeal of the poll tax. By the end of the session, Huey had regained firm control of the legislature, including 1/3 of the old regular bloc from New Orleans. Again, he staggered his opponents. Instead of leading a revolt and overthrowing his speaker, they found themselves more completely under his domination. He had run roughshod over the legislature, treating you with such contempt and domination that several of his most embedded opponents gave up and abandoned any serious effort to thwart him. In July 1934, a convoy of olive-drab trucks rumbled through the streets of New Orleans. The trucks carried 12 companies of Louisiana National Guard. Later that night, dozens of young soldiers, clad in khaki, with helmets strapped beneath smooth chins, with rifles on their shoulders, marched across the tree-lined Lafayette Square and busted through the double wooden doors of the Soul Building, where the Register of Voters office was located. The troopers belonged to Huey Long, who recently had passed legislation giving him control over local elections, and he sent them to commandeer the voting lists and finish the jobs that C.S. Barnes started. About 2 hours later, Mayor Walmsley drove up in his Pierce Arrow, followed by carloads of other city officials. The Soul Building sat directly across the street from the mayor's office in the white marbled Gallier Hall, and just up the block from the Choctaw Club. Seeing Huey's troopers standing guard across the street, Walmsley ordered several hundred of his own policemen to defend Gallier Hall. A stifling tenseness permeated the night as soldiers and policemen, rifles and machine guns, cocked and loaded, took aim at each other across the 30-foot street. Huey had declared open war on New Orleans, the old regulars, and the city's mayor. As his National Guardsmen surrounded City Hall, he ordered Governor Allen to declare martial law throughout the city. Soon after, he had the state's remaining 2,500 National Guardsmen brought by train from garrisons across the state. The soldiers camped at Jackson Barracks, at the Toulouse Street warehouses owned by the Dock Board, and in tents on the Robin Street Wharf. A few of them bivouacked at Huey's home on Audubon Boulevard, where, according to his son Russell, they camped right out there in our garage. Meanwhile, Walmsley deputized 400 special policemen and armed some of them with machine guns and tear gas. With dozens of rifle barrels sticking out of his windows, the white marbled City Hall looked like a fortress under siege. One of Huey's motives for invading New Orleans was to embarrass Mayor Walmsley. On the eve of the Democratic primary scheduled for September 11th, he hoped that this invasion would make Walmsley appear weak and unable to control his own city, and, if necessary, he could station guardsmen at the voting precincts to ensure that the election went his way. His attempt to embarrass Walmsley backfired somewhat, as the press widely covered the invasion of the National Guardsmen and, with few exceptions, condemned the military action. By order of the 27 laws passed by the legislature in a special session last month, the New York Times reported in a front-page article, Senator Huey P. Long became de facto dictator of this state at noon today and immediately began acting the part. In theaters across the country, newsreels showed music scores and scenes of a confident, smiling Huey standing in front of his Audubon Boulevard home, Walmsley sitting sternly at his desk as the guardsmen wearing masks and manning machine gun nests in government buildings. A week before, Huey had ordered the legislature to create a special committee from both houses to investigate charges of corruption in New Orleans and had himself appointed the counsel to the committee. Law and order is needed in New Orleans, he declared before the special session. The good people of this city must be protected. On September 1st, just after his 41st birthday, he arrived in New Orleans to begin the investigation, roaring through the streets at the head of a cavalcade of huge sedans, their sirens wailing. Wearing a striped straw hat, a tan silk suit over a lavender shirt, and white spats over his sporty shoes, he was in a combative mode as he strutted into the Roosevelt. With him were the 7 legislators of his new committee, none of them from New Orleans, that would investigate gambling and vice in the city. After he arrived, he set up a radio studio in his Roosevelt suite and spoke several times a day on a regular schedule. Ladies and gentlemen, he began each broadcast, it's Huey P. Long again, telling you how we're going to clean out this rotten bunch of grafters. He promised that he would stamp out prostitution in the city. The red light district has expanded to the point of national disgrace, he declared. So he's setting up a radio show, essentially his own podcast, in his hotel suite, and he's on a regularly scheduled day and time coming on there speaking to the people. I'm sure that was pretty rare in those times as well. Soon after dark on September 2nd, Huey and his investigating committee crowded into a bare, paper-littered room on the Senate Insurance Commission suite on the 18th floor of the Canal Bank building, 1 block from the Roosevelt Hotel. 50 of his National Guardsmen filled the lobby and refused admission to newspapermen, photographers, and visitors, including Earl Long, while a crowd of several hundred stood outside. For the next 2 weeks, Huey interrogated dozens of people as he sat at a wooden table in front of 2 microphones, broadcasting across the state by radio. His aides hustled witnesses, many never identified, secretly in and out of the hearings by freight elevators. They described rampant vice and corruption in the city, named gambling dens and brothels, and swore that payoffs went to the police and even to the mayor. Huey claimed that Walmsley and his ring cronies collected $13 million a year in graft. After calling several people who testified they had bribed New Orleans policemen, he ordered Police Chief Greg Rayer to appear. Huey grilled the chief about his lavish lifestyle and how he managed to deposit $31,900 into the policeman's credit union on a salary of $400 a month. The aggressive questioning made Rayer sweat. "Take off your coat, Chief," he told Rayer at one point of the interrogation. "You look like it's getting hot in here." Soon after Rayer testified, Huey felt satisfied that he had embarrassed Walmsley and the old regulars and closed the hearings. While Huey was holding his hearings, the tension in the city rose on September 6th when Colonel Guy Moloney arrived in New Orleans aboard the SS Cicada. Powerful, square jaw, and with wavy dark hair, Moloney served as New Orleans police chief from 1920 to 25, but was forced to resign because of his strong-arm tactics. Since then, he spent most of his time as a soldier of fortune, traveling around Central and South America and fighting in insurrections. He had returned from Honduras after Walmsley and the Ring telegraphed him to come to the city. Once settled into the St. Charles Hotel, the hotbed of anti-Long sentiment, Moloney met Walmsley at Gallier Hall to devise a plan to combat Huey's forces. Walmsley agreed to hire several thousand special policemen, and Moloney, a skilled and ruthless mercenary, would lead them. Moloney soon realized that New Orleans police force was no match for the young, well-trained, heavily armed National Guardsmen. If a firefight erupted, the police would be destroyed. "They didn't dare look at us twice," remembered one of Huey's guardsmen. "We were young, we were crazy, and we would do what we were told. They had big fat bellies and weren't about to start a fight with us." 2 nights after Moloney arrived, the old regulars held an anti-Long rally at the corner of Claiborne and Canal Streets. Rain began to pour down early on September 11th, but the stormy weather did not stop New Orleans from turning out to vote in the Democratic primary. The New York Times reported that the election was as peaceful as a Quaker village on Sunday morning. For at the last minute, Police Chief Rayer and the National Guard's General Fleming agreed to keep the police and the guardsmen away from the polls. Without that agreement, who knows what might have happened, and newspapermen remembered. Everyone had a gun, these guardsmen were all over the streets, and the election was just a couple days away. It could have been a disaster. On the day after the election, Huey's 3,000 National Guardsmen began boarding trains to leave the city. Huey's candidates did well. His slate totaled more than 141,000 votes, compared to roughly 100,000 for the old regulars. In New Orleans, all 4 of his major candidates won, including incumbent Congressman Paul Maloney and Bathtub Joe Fernandez, and his candidate for Louisiana Supreme Court, Judge Archie Higgins. James O'Connor, Huey's candidate for the Public Service Commission, defeated his bitter enemy, Francis Williams. By winning all the important New Orleans races, Huey handed Walmsley and the Choctaws a devastating defeat and captured a political stronghold that had eluded him for years. His only defeats were in congressional races outside of the New Orleans area, where 5 anti-Long congressmen, led by J.Y. Sanders, Jr., were victorious. All of them had declared their allegiance for Roosevelt. So look at a power move right there. I mean, to show you how his mind worked. Right before the local elections, he brings in the National Guard. He shows the weakness of the governor. And then he starts his little podcast from his hotel. Then he starts interrogations, live over the airwaves interrogations. So not only having people come on there, to point out the prostitution and the illegal gambling going on, but the payoffs as well. And then to bring the police chief in, top it all off, and embarrass him by pointing out his obvious corruption. And all of that helps him in his dominating win in New Orleans. As stated, all the major races he won in a city that's hated him forever, thanks to the old regulars and the old system. That's their stronghold. So he had a very high political IQ and cunning, because he does it over and over again. Sometimes like a bull in a china shop, and other times very subtle. Huey was rough on Fournette before the election. He grabbed the lieutenant governor and told him to buy some good clothes, get himself fixed up. "God damn it, at least try to look like a judge," he growled as he straightened Fournette's tie. Huey later chewed out Fournette for his poor speaking ability. John, if you don't get better by tomorrow morning, you're going to be a beat potato. You're going to stay up all night practicing your speech. Huey, along with his brother Earl, who had rejoined the Long Forces, campaigned hard for Fournette. In a special election, Fournette won by more than 4,000 votes, defeating Porter, an able jurist with years of experience on the bench. Despite the fact Fournette had never held any judicial position, never tried an important case, and never practiced beyond the immediate neighborhood of the small country town of Jennings. Once again, none of that mattered. Vote for Fournette was a vote for Huey. Freedom of speech is one thing and freedom of taxation is another, Huey declared during the summer of 1934. I believe in freedom of speech, but it's got to be truthful speech, and lying newspapers should have to pay for their lying. I'm going to help these newspapers by hitting them in the pocketbooks. Maybe they'll try to clean up. From the beginning of his political career, Huey fought a stubborn battle against the large newspapers. Most politicians would never have been so rash as to attack the large newspapers. Huey was different. Although one of the state's shrewder attorneys, he had no conflict between his efforts to throttle the newspaper coverage and the constitutional guarantee of freedom of the press. He vowed to always hit the big man first. And to him, the press was just another big man. His battle with newspapers became intensely personal. If he did not like what the press printed about him, he did not hesitate in taking whatever action necessary to throttle coverage. Soon after becoming governor, he ordered the chairman of the tax commission to raise the property assessments on the 3 New Orleans newspapers that opposed him. When the communist newspaper, the Daily Worker, criticized the Kingfish near the end of 1934, he pressured the New Orleans post office to halt delivery of the paper. In February 1933, Huey lost his temper at New Orleans' largest paper. The Depression was causing banks across the nation to fail, and runs on banks were common. At the time, the Hibernia Bank of New Orleans experienced a run that exhausted $1 million of its cash reserve. Huey learned that the Times-Picayune published an extra in the afternoon that leaked the proceedings of a secret meeting he held to stave off the bank crisis. Huey, who had not eaten but was drunk in his Roosevelt hotel suite, exploded. With his eyes popped out and face crimson, he told Seymour Weiss to call General Fleming and order the National Guard to march down, take over the Times-Picayune, and wreck its presses. Weiss, who feared the public outcry of destroying the presses as well as the legal aftermath, went to another room to make the call and to tell Fleming to drag his feet and delay getting to the Roosevelt. By the time Fleming arrived, a couple hours later, Weiss had sobered Huey enough to call off the raid. Yeah, don't get Huey pissed when he's whiskey bent, that's for sure. Huey had failed in his early attempts to strangle the press. During the 1930 regular legislative session, he proposed a 15% tax on all gross revenues received by Louisiana newspapers from advertising sales. Another bill would have allowed the state to halt the printing of any newspapers that was malicious, scandalous, or defamatory. His opponents killed both the newspaper tax and the gag bill in committee. Undaunted, he again attacked the press by publishing a second, more ambitious newspaper. On August 24, 1933, Huey released the first issue of American Progress. He had discontinued his original Louisiana Progress when the New Orleans item began supporting him in 1930. But 3 years later, the item joined the anti-Long forces after he broke with Walmsley and the old regulars. With no New Orleans daily supporting him, Huey created another newspaper. At first, he published American Progress similar in style and pugnacity to its predecessor, as a weekly, but in April 1934 converted the paper to a monthly with 150,000 subscribers. He printed American Progress in Mississippi to avoid Louisiana libel laws. Huey never abandoned his obsession to tax the state's large newspapers out of business. In November 1933, he warned the daily newspapers in a speech in Marksville, "Take those lying Times-Picayune, Shreveport Times, and Alexandria Town Talk. We're going to sock a tax on those damned rascals. Let them scoundrels pay for the privilege." At the same time, his American Progress listed a newspaper tax among legislation to be sought at the next session. "The people must again fight their own battle," reported the Progress. "Watch out for the lying newspapers." During the regular session of the summer of 1934, Huey proposed a 2% tax on the gross advertising sales by newspapers, with circulations over 20,000. The tax affected only the dailies in New Orleans and other urban centers, and of those papers, only the Lake Charles American Press was not rabidly anti-Long. It's a tax on lying, he declared. Later, anti-Long Representative Rupert Payton of Caddo Parish pointed out that if a newspaper tax was a tax on lying, then Huey himself would be affected because he published his own propaganda vehicle. And if every lie published in American Progress is taxed, money would flood the state's treasury. On Monday, July 2nd, with little discussion from legislators, the House Ways and Means Committee reported that the newspaper tax bill favorably by a vote of 10-3. The bill reached the House floor 3 days later. Huey paced up and down the aisles, giving orders to his supporters on how to vote. Representative Payton protested his presence on the floor. "We are treated to the rotten spectacle of his piscatorial majesty, the crawfish giving orders in the House, interrupting debate, and otherwise disporting himself as anything but a gentleman," Payton declared. "I am sick and tired of all this, and I think every other member is disgusted too." Representative Norman Bower attacked the newspaper tax as a spite bill, pure and simple. It's a punitive measure and should receive no consideration at all. Huey, standing nearby, responded with a Bronx cheer and a satisfied smile, and Speaker Ellender rapped for order. A Long supporter asked Bower what effect the tax on advertising would have on the freedom of press. Bower responded that the only purpose of this tax is to warn every paper in the state, large and small, to line up and to stop criticizing the administration, or they'll suffer a similar fate. I hope the members of the House will not bow to the will of a dictator. When one of Huey's supporters, Representative Loris Wimberly, seemed uncertain what motion to offer, Bower sarcastically observed, "I wish Senator Long would make up his mind so Mr. Wimberly will know what to do." On July 10th, with Huey standing inside the rail, the House passed the tax like it was greased, 56-38. Huey personally cast a vote for an absentee legislator. No one objected. On the next day, the Senate Finance Committee considered the newspaper tax bill. Huey arrived early and supervised the proceedings. With little discussion, the committee approved the bill 9-2. When the bill reached the Senate floor, Huey paced back and forth impatiently. Soon he rushed up to his floor leader, Senator Coleman Winsley of the Webster Parish, and ordered a vote taken, while he stood menacingly in front of the chamber, carefully watching the lights on the voting machine signal how each senator voted. The Senate passed the newspaper tax within 20 minutes and without further discussion. The large state newspapers angrily attacked the tax. Freedom of the press will survive this assault in Louisiana, just as surely as representative government, now chloroformed by the usurper, will be restored, the Times-Picayune reported. But the rape of representative government and the assault upon the free press, just driven to success by the openly wielding lash of a dictator without principle, honest conviction, or scruple, constitute the blackest chapter in Louisiana's history. On the same day, the Monroe News-Star angrily reported that Louisiana becomes the first state in the Union to throw a halter around the press in an effort to stifle criticism of legislative authority. The New Orleans item warned that the tax, if carried to its logical conclusion, will mean the end in practice not only of freedom of American press, but virtually to freedom of speech as well. Yeah, you see how they shriek when you start forcing them to be accountable for what they say. 8 months later, on March 22, 1935, a 3-judge federal court ruled Huey's 2% gross revenue tax on newspapers discriminatory because it taxed only large newspapers. The court did not rule on the constitutionality of the tax and its infringements upon the freedom of the press. A year later, however, the U.S. Supreme Court, usually split during New Deal fights, made the unusual unanimous decision invalidating Huey's newspaper advertising tax as a violation of the free press. So yeah, and the federal government definitely did what they can to break up the dictatorship of Huey Long in Louisiana. And that's just another example of that. No, you can't add a 2% tax on big newspapers for advertisement. That 2%, goes into the state's coffer, back to the people, to the book programs, road programs. But yeah, even a 2% tax on advertisement. Not even the tax on lying, what he really wanted to get across on them. Yeah, so you see how the silly system comes in when a man is trying to build something. And this is, of course, why Roosevelt feared Huey as well. All right, let us continue on. While thousands of citizens across Louisiana worshipped Huey Long, thousands others detested him. Some of his enemies even talked of ways to have him killed, and although most of them probably would not have committed the murderous act if given the chance, there were some who despised him enough to pull the trigger. Many of those who hated Huey were middle and upper class. Some were otherwise refined women like Hilda Hammond and the unstable Miss Pleasant. Kathleen Gibbons, Mayor Walmsley's niece, recalled that the table talk always seemed to be about killing him. Huey Long was just hated, she told an interviewer years later. Betty Carter was one of those refined ladies who despised the Kingfish. Born into New Orleans elite society, Miss Carter represented the archetypal Southern gentlewoman, the kind who wore a string of pearls and white lace gloves to afternoon tea, where black waiters in starched white coats served little cucumber sandwiches with the crust cut off. Cultured, well-bred, and perfectly codified, she was an unlikely candidate to plot a murder. We used to try to think of ways to kill Huey, Miss Carter admitted. He would come and speak in the bandstand in the park, and listeners would sit on folding chairs. I thought we should take a sharp nail with a point made even sharper and dip it in tetanus and stick it up on one of those chairs where he'd sit on it. He wouldn't know it, and he would die a death he deserved, the death of a mad dog. The hotbed of Huey hatred was Baton Rouge. On New Year's Day, 1935, Standard Oil fired 3,800 workers from its Baton Rouge refinery to offset the cost of his latest 5 cents per barrel tax. When Huey learned that Standard Oil threatened to move its refinery from Louisiana, he showed no concern. If they got to leave, he declared, they can go to hell and stay there. 3 weeks later, the Baton Rouge police jury met, and 13 new, long-appointed council members fired 225 city workers. The Baton Rougians, the combined firing of city employees and Standard Oil workers, was the tragic final scene of a 6-year melodrama of repressive attacks by Huey upon the capital city. Tempers flared, and there was a wildness in the air. That week, several dozen of Huey's more angry enemies met in Baton Rouge and formed the Square Deal Association. Led by Ernest Borges, a 29-year-old unemployed Standard Oil engineer, the Square Dealers at first demanded the repeal of all dictatorial laws, especially the 5-cent oil processing tax, but soon they turned more hostile and threatened armed violence to topple Huey. Several hundred members joined in Baton Rouge, and chapters sprung up in a dozen parishes. Members included Mayor Walmsley and former Governor Parker, while Hilda Hammond and Miss Pleasant joined the Square Dealers Woman Auxiliary. The more belligerent chapters organized themselves into militia-like companies, began gathering weapons, and drew up plans to march on the Capitol. Huey returned from Washington on January 19th after he learned of the Square Dealer threat. When he talked to reporters, he appeared unworried. The fellows won't march unless you give them a buggy or a rickshaw, he remarked. They're too lazy to march. But Huey knew that they were determined to challenge his power. On Friday, January 25th, the day after the firing of the parish workers, about 300 of Borges's men, all armed and wearing button pins on their lapel saying, "Direct Action," marched on the Baton Rouge courthouse and barricaded themselves behind locked doors. Huey ordered National Guard troops sent to Baton Rouge, and later that day, the first truck rolled into town with an infantry company from Crowley. Soon, 800 troops encamped around the Capitol, and when the Square Dealers learned of the force mustered against them, they abandoned the courthouse. That afternoon, Huey told O.K. Allen to declare martial law in Baton Rouge. Allen outlawed the carrying of firearms, forbid newspapers from criticizing state government, and prohibited crowds of 2 or more people. The martial law order lasted 6 months. On the following day, a cool Saturday afternoon, about 350 square dealers, many armed with hunting rifles, gathered at the Baton Rouge airport located 3 miles east of the city at the end of Government Street. Huey learned of the meeting beforehand and ordered 2 companies of his National Guardsmen to the scene. The ragtag group of square dealers was no match for his 500 dragoons armed with military rifles and machine guns. When the soldiers deployed in battle line and hurled tear gas bombs, half of the square dealers surrendered, and the other half retreated into the woods behind the airport. We seized a truckload of guns, one of Huey's bodyguards remembered. The only square dealer injured was George Alassi, a Tangipora Parish police juror who received an accidental shotgun wound in the arm from one of his own retreating compatriots. On Sunday night, Huey returned to Washington after learning that Borges and other square deal leaders had fled the state. So Huey quickly squashes that attempted insurrection and goes back to Washington, deal with the bigger issues at hand. Our men of affairs and powers that be are in a maze of confusion, Huey Long bellowed loudly on the floor of the United States Senate in late January 1935. The hand of death has gripped the souls of our leaders. It has calloused their hearts and cankered their minds. Now fighting almost every measure put forth by the Roosevelt administration, he rose to attack the resolution supported by the president to abide by the rulings of the World Court. The Los Angeles Times reported that Huey, with the fury of a fire-breathing monster, thundered for 3 straight hours, providing his colleagues in a packed gallery of amused spectators with a masterful example of his infamous oratory, loud, long, and scathing. Swinging his arms like an angry gorilla, Huey wove in and out of aisles and desks and tore into every adversary. His voice rising to camp meeting pitch, he attacked the Roosevelt administration, Standard Oil Company, United Fruit Company, and the Department of Justice, and its Mother Hubbard opinions, the League of Nations, and the Postmaster General Jim Farley. He labeled Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and rhetorically answered his own question. To get rid of the devil, did we get a witch? Just when Huey's harangue began to become tiresome and trite and no longer humorous, he returned to his fight against the World Court. Emphasizing the facts he possessed, he gave a reasoned argument to vote against a resolution that otherwise would have quickly passed with little debate. Senator William Borah of Idaho claimed that Huey was the only man who knew he could defend a wrong premise and reach a right conclusion. Huey argued that the nation should never again become entangled in European disputes. I do not intend to have these gentlemen, whose names I can't even pronounce, let alone spell, passing upon the rights of American people. I do not intend to vote for this infernal thing. When he finished, the Senate defeated the World Court resolution, 52 senators for it, 36 against, 7 votes short of the needed 2/3 majority. Huey no longer obliquely criticized the Roosevelt administration. His attacks now were head-on, bare-faced, brutish, and disrespectful, as when he snidely lingered over each syllable of the president's name, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. With the galleries packed and 100 congressmen lining the walls of the Senate chamber, he charged that Roosevelt's men in New Orleans controlled a red light district, 18 squares long and 16 squares wide, and packed with houses of ill fame and gambling dens. In another speech, he accused Roosevelt of going back on his word to redistribute the nation's wealth. He's a liar and a faker, Huey roared. No heart has ever been so saddened, no person's ambition was ever so blighted as was mine when I came to the realization that the President of the United States was not going to undertake what he said he would do, and what I knew to be necessary if the people of America were ever to be saved from calamity and misery. No longer hiding his personal enmity for the president, Huey fought the second New Deal legislation intensely and made thinly veiled suggestions that he might himself run for the presidency. Huey argued that both Hoover and Roosevelt had let the common man down. Don't you remember when Mr. Hoover proposed to plow up every 4th row of cotton? He asked the Senate. Roosevelt's plan was to plow up every 3rd row of cotton. While millions have starved and gone naked, while babies have cried and died for milk. So it has been that while people have begged for meat and bread, Mr. Roosevelt's administration has sailed merrily along, plowing under and destroying the things to eat and wear, with tear-dimmed eyes and hungry souls made to chant for his New Deal. Is this government? It looks more like a St. Vitus's dance. During the first 3 months of 1935, he attacked the president dozens of times on the Senate floor and made 6 anti-long radio broadcasts on NBC, including major addresses titled Our Growing Calamity on January 23rd and Our Plundering Government on February 10th. On February 11th, Huey strutted around the Senate with his hands stuck in his pockets and his coat unbuttoned to reveal bright red suspenders. He launched a bitter attack upon Roosevelt's former campaign manager, Postmaster General Jim Farley, titling his speech, Farley, A Menace to Clean Politics. He branded the Postmaster General as a demon political ringmaster and political tyrant, and accused him of personally profiting from the post office construction in New York City, being implicated in wire services to gambling houses and giving $80,000 worth of new commemorative stamps to friends. When he accused Farley of forcing federal employees to make campaign contributions to the Democratic Party, another senator chided Huey that this was also practiced in Louisiana. Without breaking stride, he answered that donations were voluntary in Louisiana, and besides, there was no state law against soliciting political contributions. On Sunday night, March 3rd, Huey attacked Roosevelt and Farley on New Orleans radio. Still bitter over not being given federal patronage, he again lost his temper. If I must kneel to such crooks as may be employed by men like Jim Farley, Huey shouted, God send me to hell before I bring myself to go through that kind of thing to get patronage. Later that month, Huey delivered several blistering tirades against Farley on the Senate floor. Jim can take the corns off your feet without removing your shoes, he charged as he motioned to a formal Senate investigation of the Postmaster General. The Senate, soon tired of the attacks on Farley, declared the accusations frivolous and without merit, and rejected his motion of an investigation 62-20, with the vote falling along party lines. After the Senate defeated his motion, a reporter asked Huey why he went after Farley. Jim was the biggest rooster in the yard, he admitted, and I thought that if I could break his legs, the rest would be easy. You got to respect that go after the biggest guy in the room mentality he has. Roosevelt lost his patience with Huey and struck back. In February, the president ordered the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to provide him with a list of federal employees working in Louisiana, and told his aides to fire any worker who was a Long supporter. In April, Roosevelt increased the pressure on Huey by withholding huge amounts of federal aid. The president suspended $2.5 million earmarked for New Orleans sewerage and water projects that would have employed at least 2,000 workers. Later that month, Interior Secretary Harold Ikes stopped $10 million of Public Works Administration projects for Louisiana because the legislature would use the projects and their associated jobs to further strengthen the Kingfish machine. Huey curtly replied that Ikes could go slapdam to hell. Roosevelt recruited General Hugh Johnson, the sharp-tongued former head of the National Recovery Administration, to lead a counterattack. On Monday night, March 4th, Johnson assailed Huey in a speech at the New Orleans Waldorf Astoria. In the speech broadcast on national radio, Johnson called Huey one of the Pied Pipers of the lunatic fringe, and compared him to the Fuhrer. Hitler couldn't hold a candle to Huey in the art of the old Barnum ballyhoo, Johnson bellowed into the microphone. On the following Thursday night, NBC gave Huey 45 minutes of airtime to respond to Johnson. 25 million Americans listened in, expecting to be entertained with another of his colorful harangues. Huey, however, surprised his audience. He didn't swipe insults with Johnson, but used the time to give a steady, calculated 20-minute critique of Roosevelt's New Deal, saying it differed little from Hoover's plan. Back in the kitchen, he declared, the same set of cooks are fixing up the victuals. Speaking earnestly in the radio microphone with finely chosen words, he then set forth the Share Our Wealth plan. He painted an idyllic picture of the national utopia created by his program to distribute the nation's wealth. Appearing calm and logical, he transformed himself, as one reporter described, from a clown into a real political menace. By the time he finished, Johnson looked heavy-handed and probably had done more harm than good by attacking the Kingfish. Huey, on the other hand, used his radio time to convince millions of Americans that share our wealth was a realistic solution to the Depression, and that Huey Long, despite what his critics said, was not so crazy after all. Let's go into some of the proposals of Share Our Wealth real fast, and also what he put forth in his book, My First Days in the White House, which was kind of a satirical tale of him winning presidency and what he would do, but also with real proposals put in within the story. So part of it is cap personal fortunes at $50 million each. That's about equivalent to about $600 million today. To cap personal yearly fortune to, the numbers change anywhere from $5 million to $8 million, which is anywhere up to $100 million today. Limit inheritances to $5 million. Guarantee every family annual income of $2,000 or 1/3 of the national average. Free college education and vocational training. Old age pensions for all persons over 60. Veterans benefits and health care. A 30-hour work week. A 4-week vacation for every worker yearly. That's kind of like the Joy Through Strength thing. Greater regulation of commodity production to stabilize prices. Let's go on. Huey delivered at least one of his anti-Roosevelt speeches while dead drunk. He was so tight he could hardly walk, one of his workers remembered. We had to hold him up there when he first started, but after he got into his speech, why, you wouldn't even know he had a drink. And he made some of his best speeches drunk. According to Chick Frampton, he only needed half a pint of whiskey to put him on a rip-roaring bender. I've been under the influence of liquor more nights of my adult life than I've been sober, Huey told a bodyguard. And out of this have come some of my most brilliant ideas of my career. Foreign embassies delivered whiskey by the case to his Washington hotel room. By the middle of 1934, however, he realized that he must curtail his night owl lifestyle of noisy clubs and smoke-filled bars. He was not so much worried about his health, which had deteriorated from years of liquor and fried food and little sleep, but realized that his frequent carousing interfered with his one and only goal of amassing political power. From June 1934 through July 1935, he avoided the capital's racy night spots, no longer drank, and gave up his cigarettes and, for a while, his cherished cigars. Several days a week, just after dawn, Huey played a round of golf at Washington's Congressional Country Club. He went on a diet and reduced his weight from 200 pounds to about 175, although still in generally poor health. When he celebrated his 42nd birthday on August 30, 1935, Huey amazed his enemies in Washington with his unrelenting energy. Huey again needed to create new revenues to match his spending on highways and new state employees. He doubled the inspection fee paid by public utilities and raised the rates on several other taxes. When Huey took office in 1928, Louisiana was known as a state with few taxes, mainly local property tax, inheritance tax, occupational license tax, and a severance tax on oil and minerals. By 1935, some 45 separate taxes reaped $38 million in state revenues, a 75% increase over 1927. According to one of Huey's workers, his theory on taxation was to cover everything in sight and to throw out a network of taxes with low rates to cover everything. The increase in revenues was still not enough, however, as Huey continued to outspend the state's income. By this time, bonds had overtaken taxes as the primary force of financing his projects. In 1935, Louisiana had the second highest per capita state debt in the nation, with the debt increasing from $11 million to $150 million during his reign. Near the end of the session, Huey surprised the citizens of Baton Rouge, who still could not gather in crowds because troops patrolled the streets under martial law. Only a couple months before, the residents of the capital city fought the Kingfish bitterly over the new oil processing tax. But he now reversed direction and announced a compromise with Standard Oil. He agreed to rebate 4 of the 5 cents of the processing tax back to the oil company, while the president of Standard Oil, J.C. Hilton, agreed that the Baton Rouge refinery would get 80% of its crude oil from Louisiana wells and would take back the discharged workers. While Huey had been bitterly attacking Standard Oil in the press, he was negotiating behind the scenes with the oil giant to cut a deal. On January 22nd, a week before the session convened, Huey and Hilton had met secretly and made the agreement. Several of Huey's close supporters were independent oil drillers who would profit if Standard Oil agreed to use more Louisiana crude. Over a 5-year period, Huey's tax assessors lowered the property value of Standard Baton Rouge refinery from $44 million to $34 million. So, like was spoken about earlier in the video, one of the big issues with Standard Oil was they were taking out of the Gulf of Mexico mainly, using the oil from there. And now, at least with this deal, as he pulls back on 80% of the tax he put upon them, they agree to use 80% of local refineries, of the local crude. Huey Long was not alone in calling for drastic reform of the national economy. The Great Depression spawned a number of reformers who offered a range of panaceas to bring the prostrate nation to its feet. Senator Robert Lafayette and his brother Governor Philip Lafayette, rebuilders of the Progressive Party in Wisconsin, hoped to expand into a national third party. Milo Reno, head of the Farm Holiday Association, campaigned for higher prices for crops, and by 1935 championed his own third party. In 1933, the cadaverous Dr. Francis Townsend proposed that the federal government provide every person over 60 with a monthly pension of $200. The pensioners would immediately spend the money and create new jobs, ending the Depression. Townsend clubs enlisted 2 million members by the end of 1935. In 1934, the Detroit priest Father Charles Coughlin organized the National Union for Social Justice, which denounced President Roosevelt's New Deal and advocated silver inflation and the nationalization of banks, utilities, and natural resources. Coughlin made weekly radio broadcasts over CBS to between 30 and 45 million listeners. Each of these reformers by himself did not constitute a major nationwide political force. Only by combining the strength of two or more could a third-party movement become a political threat to the Democrats and Republicans. Of the firebrand reformers, only Huey Long, with his steadily growing Share Our Wealth following, possessed a solid political base, and only Huey held senatorial office to use as a springboard to gather about him millions of voters. During the spring of 1935, after Coughlin visited Huey several times in Washington's Broadmoor Hotel, speculation built that the two men would unite. Franklin Roosevelt, who would run for re-election in a year, feared that a third-party candidate would not necessarily win the election, but would siphon off enough Democratic votes to enable a Republican victory. Roosevelt also knew that Huey was the man most capable of accomplishing this feat. A secret poll commissioned by Jim Farley predicted that Huey would garner as many as 3 million votes across the nation and could capture the swing vote in critical states such as New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Huey knew it too. On February 4th, 1935, he donned his favorite red suspenders in honor of Georgia Governor Eugene Talmadge and gave a rousing stump speech to the Georgia legislature in Atlanta. A month later, he appeared in Philadelphia, where 16,000 spectators packed the city's convention hall to listen to him attack Roosevelt for an hour and a half. With Hoover, it was stupidity. With Roosevelt, it is betrayal, he roared. From Philadelphia, he took the train to Columbia, South Carolina, and gave more rousing speeches to charge mostly enthusiastic audiences. Every time Huey spoke, he drummed up supporters and more national publicity. He seems to have the integrity and insight of a Jefferson, the sturdy, uncompromising, and aggressive spontaneity of a Jackson, and the combination of wit and humanitarianism that has made Lincoln a popular idol. One journalist wrote after being enthralled by one of his performances, "As his popularity grew, Huey began to draw support from across the country and from the more affluent, not just from the poor living in the rural South. Of his many followers, probably his most unlikely admirer was the talented, wealthy young architect named Philip Johnson. Johnson was a 28-year-old Harvard graduate with a cleft chin and a rebellious expression. In December 1934, he had quit his first job as head of the Museum of Modern Art's Architecture Department to pursue his passion for right-wing politics. The year before, Johnson had traveled across Europe, where he became captivated with Adolf Hitler. After he heard the dictator speak at a Potsdam rally, he was impressed with Hitler's manipulation of power and populism and shared his contempt for Jews. I became what was later called a fascist, Johnson recalled years later. After he returned to the United States, Johnson formed his own gray-shirted nationalist party. He was looking for a strong-willed political boss to whip weak America into shape. Things were bad in the 30s. We've got plenty of wheat and grain and trees, and why is there hunger? He asked himself. Admiring spellbinding orators, he turned to Huey Long. To him, Huey was going to fix everything, and was the only man who could save America. I am leaving in 3 weeks to be Huey Long's Minister of Fine Arts, Johnson wrote his boss at the Museum of Modern Art. Just after Christmas, 1934, Johnson piled his clothes into a big Packard convertible and, accompanied by a Harvard classmate and several volumes of Nietzsche, Machiavelli, and Shakespeare, left New York City and drove south towards Louisiana. Johnson arrived in Baton Rouge after the New Year and went immediately to the state capitol. The architect soon became famous for his modernistic glass box designs, despised the type of Art Deco decorating the Capitol. He asked to meet with Huey, ready to volunteer to become a part of his political movement, write speeches, or help in any way he could. Huey, however, cared a little bit about people like Philip Johnson and refused to see him. One of his people said to me, "How many votes do you control?" Johnson hung around Baton Rouge until he learned that Huey was returning to Washington. He jumped aboard Huey's train and continued to pressure his aides. Finally, Johnson was ushered into a stateroom where the Kingfish received him dressed in silk pajamas. Huey rejected the speeches he had drafted in polished English and sent him off to Ohio with orders to organize the state for his upcoming presidential bid. I mean, yeah, which is kind of silly. You're going to write a speech in refined English for, this southern bombastic orator. I can just jump up on a podium without a prepared written speech and then keep the crowd captivated for an hour while making his points. Yeah, you can see why he turned that down. Huey's popularity continued to soar during the following spring. On April 1st, 1935, his smiling face appeared on the cover of Time magazine, and 3 weeks later he spoke at Milo Reno's Farm Holiday Association in Des Moines, Iowa. A crowd of 18,000 jammed into the state fairgrounds grandstand and loudly applauded his attacks on the New Deal. "I can take Roosevelt," he boasted to a New York Times reporter after the rally. "He's scared of me. I can outpromise him and he knows it." Later that summer, Huey boasted to a New York Times writer that if the 1936 presidential election pitted the Democrat Roosevelt against the Republican Hoover, then your next president will be Huey Long. Huey knew, however, that such a third-party victory was unlikely. Instead, he reveled to his close supporters a more realistic, simple, and rather sinister plan. According to Huey, either he or another third-party candidate would take enough left-wing votes from Roosevelt in the 1936 election to allow a Republican, probably Hoover, to win. With the economy still in shambles, the Republican president then would be an easy target for Huey as a 1940 Democratic nominee. He saw nothing wrong with letting the nation suffer 4 miserable years in order to demonstrate that the country needed him as president. He planned to destroy both the Democratic and Republican parties and would be president for 4 terms. "I'm going to abolish the Electoral College," he told one writer, "have universal suffrage, and I'll defy any son of a bitch to get me out under 4 terms. Huey was able to gain unprecedented and immense power for several reasons. He was brilliant, talented, energetic, unscrupulous. He benefited from disorganized opponents. His enemies were formidable, wealthy, and had the means to destroy him early in his political career, but over and over they underestimated his ruthless determination, and he bounced back stronger each time that they thought they had defeated him. On several occasions, the New York Times predicted that his reign was rapidly coming to an end, only to see him rise again. His more powerful opponents, the Bourbon Planters and New Orleans Ring, never before faced anyone of his energy, intelligence, and lust for power, and they were unable to put aside their own petty differences to build an organized effort to crush him. Before they realized it, it was Huey who did the crushing, and by then it was too late. Huey took advantage of the political strife that he created in Louisiana. By 1935, the state was divided down the middle between his followers and enemies. The struggle between the two warring factions was intense, and the potential for armed conflict increased each day. Tempers flared and fistfights erupted with little provocation. There was no room for independence. Everyone had to choose on which side to fight. The grinding poverty of the Depression that affected most Louisianans created a fertile environment for Huey to rise to power. An impoverished people wanted change, and he offered lots of it. He kept attacking the rich. The billionaires are becoming bigger billionaires. The millionaires are becoming bigger millionaires. The poor are becoming poorer, and the middle class is disappearing, he roared in a speech. While Huey's heavy-handed methods may have been more ruthless and increasingly demagogic, he nevertheless dominated the state, much as plantation aristocrats and New Orleans ward heelers had done for generations. Indeed, in 1935, the majority of the people of the state were happy to be dictated to by Huey and saw him as a much preferred alternative to the Bourbon oligarchy of the past. In 1935, Huey faced an attack from the far right. At a Ku Klux Klan convention in Atlanta, Imperial Wizard Dr. Hiram Evans declared that Huey was un-American. Evans vowed to go to Louisiana campaign against the Kingfish. When Huey heard of the wizard's comments, he gathered newsmen in the press gallery of the state senate and ordered them to tell that tooth puller, Evans, he's a lying son of a bitch. That ain't secondhand information, and it ain't confidential. He warned Evans that if he came to Louisiana, he would leave the state with his toes turned up. The wizard canceled his visit to Louisiana. The humor surrounding Huey's antics began to turn sour. To those that fought him, his perversion of the legislative process had never been funny. Newspapers across the nation no longer described him as a comical buffoon, but now expressed more sober fears. When some of them accused him of being a dictator, he refused to be categorized as stereotype and bristled at the dictatorship label. The Mobile Register reported that a ruthless dictatorship ruled Louisiana and doubted whether Republican government functioned in the state, while an Arkansas paper declared, "It is impossible to conceive of any American state being governed prematurely under such a dictatorship as that of which Huey Long exercises in Louisiana." An Iowa newspaper characterized Louisiana as a dictator's realm and called for federal intervention to guarantee democratic government. What's Washington going to do about it? The newspaper pleaded. President Roosevelt watched events in Louisiana with rising concern. When Roosevelt read about Huey's roughshod legislative tactics and his invasion of New Orleans, he held a news conference to express his shock. The president admitted, however, there was little he could do. Roosevelt considered sending federal troops into the state, but his advisors counseled him to avoid tangling with the Kingfish in his own backyard. Roosevelt is no damned fool, Huey told a reporter. He knows his place. The president did not abandon efforts to destroy Huey, however. To one senator, it was perfectly obvious Roosevelt is doing everything he can with investigations and detectives in Louisiana to get something on Long, and even on Long's friends. The Memphis Commercial Appeal reported that government agents in New Orleans had shadowed Huey's movements and tapped his phones since Roosevelt took office. An intense anti-Long movement was mounting in the U.S. House of Representatives, where J.Y. Sanders Jr. and 5 other Louisiana congressmen bitterly opposed Huey. On February 1st, 1935, Sanders rose onto the floor and attacked Huey's profound contempt for democratic institutions. Sanders warned that the situation in Louisiana should be a warning to every state in the Union and to every member of Congress. There is being forged and constructed in Louisiana today a despotism, alien in every feature to American tradition, to stamp out the flames and watchfires of democracy. As the August 1935 session of Congress ended, Speaker of the House, Joseph Bims, appointed a 7-member committee to investigate expenditures of candidates for the House of Representatives and for other purposes. Using a last-minute maneuver, the Speaker tacked his resolution for investigation onto a routine piece of legislation that passed easily. On the next day, the Washington Post revealed that other purposes meant a congressional probe of the Long regime to determine whether Louisiana had a representative form of government as guaranteed by Article 4 of the Constitution. "I don't care," Huey snapped back when he learned of the Speaker's action. "Let him investigate. We'll be glad of it." Huey knew, however, that if a House investigation requested an intervention by the President, Roosevelt would gladly comply. During his first couple years as governor, Huey made significant improvements to the lives of many Louisianans. He distributed more than 500,000 free school books, increased school enrollment by 15,000, and provided free night schools to teach illiterate adults to read. He built 9,000 miles of new roads and over 100 bridges, pulling Louisiana out of the horse and buggy days. He doubled the number of beds in the state charity hospital system and raised the state university to national stature in size and scholarship. On the afternoon of July 17, 1935, as both the temperature and humidity approached 100, 24 sweat-soaked Louisiana state policemen climbed the stairs to a third-floor apartment on St. Louis Street in New Orleans, French Quarter. With no warrant, Huey Long's heavily armed troopers smashed down the door of Oscar Wilden, a friend and backer of Mayor Walmsley. Wilden was a longtime horse and cattle breeder who led the New Orleans chapter of the Square Deal Association. That was the anti-Long group. He now belonged to a secretive and more violent anti-Long organization called the Minutemen, who had organized in the Bunkie area and now claimed 5,000 members statewide. At an earlier Minutemen rally, Wilden called for Huey to be tied to a stake and horsewhipped. The state troopers searched Wilden's armory and confiscated a pistol found in a suitcase. The ransacking of Oscar Wilden's apartment was not only a sign of conflict during the frightful summer of 1935, as the white-hot tension in New Orleans neared the boiling point. Angry city workers had either been laid off or, if still employed, unpaid, and nearly 1,000 families fell off the welfare rolls as Huey refused to contribute state funds to Roosevelt's relief program. Garbage rotted in the streets, the July swelter ignited tempers across the city, and the murder rate, already high, rose rapidly. Many New Orleans carried a gun prepared to shoot someone, and agreed that if someone was to be shot, it should be Huey Long. 4 days after state police ransacked Wilden's apartment, about 200 of Huey's most bitter opponents gathered in New Orleans and took over the entire 5th floor of the DeSoto Hotel. Huey learned of the DeSoto meeting beforehand and sent his men to eavesdrop on the gathering. Johnny d'Armond, the former assistant manager of the Istrama Hotel in Baton Rouge, whom Huey used to check upon legislators and sober them up to vote, was now a member of the secretive Bureau of Criminal Identification. d'Armond set up a dummy room where Huey's men used fishing poles to hang microphones out the hotel's big bay window and listen to conversations in adjoining rooms. Herb Christenberry, an attorney and Long loyalist, listened to the microphone and took dictation along with B.W. Kaysen, Secretary of the State Senate. The anti-Long attendees were a mixed lot. Some were Huey's die-hard political foes, the same politicians, businessmen, and newspaper editors who had fought him for years. Mayor Walmsley attended, along with J.Y. Sanders Jr., ex-Governor Parker, and the newspaper editor Harding Carter. Others who showed up were lesser known but more prone to violence. Men like Oscar Wilden, who belonged to the Square Dealers or the Minutemen. The Minutemen called for a free and independent people to levy war against the enemies of the state and began planning to march on Baton Rouge, take the capital, and if necessary, kill Huey. The advertised purpose of the conference was peaceful and political, a caucus that had to decide upon the candidates for the upcoming election in January, as well as to demonstrate to Roosevelt that a strong anti-Long political force remained in Louisiana. 5 of the state's 8 congressmen, including Joe Sandelin, Riley Wilson, J.Y. Sanders Jr., Cleveland Deer, and Numa Monette, attended the conference, announcing they were solidly behind President Roosevelt in his patriotic efforts to restore happiness and prosperity to the nation. The congressmen condemned Huey's attacks on the president as malicious. The DeSoto Conference selected Sandelin to run against Huey for Senate and Cleveland Deer to run for governor. The attendees later gave differing stories as to whether the DeSoto meeting was the scene of a murder plot. Frank Peterman, Huey's former president pro turn of the state senate and now a New Dealer, said that the DeSoto meeting was purely political, its purpose being to persuade Deer to run for governor. I don't think it was a murder plot, Johnny d'Armond remembered. Just talk. Harding Carter agreed, saying that the plotting was little more hopeful comments such as, "Good God, I wish someone would kill that son of a bitch." Harry Gamble, an anti-Long attorney, recalled, "100 said that the bastard ought to be killed, he ought to be shot, and he ought to be boiled in oil. He ought to be skinned, and so on. But as for any plot to kill him being hatched there, that's ridiculous. Others who were at the DeSoto remembered a much more sinister meeting, one that began in a room 506 at 10 in the morning on the second day of the conference, spread to other parts of the hotel, and continued until the attendees departed. There were 3 rooms, the hothead leader of the Minutemen, Dave Haas, recalled. 5 men at the meeting, 4 from Bunkie, and Dr. Carl Weiss, Baton Rouge physician unrelated to Seymour Weiss. He drew the short straw. Weiss wanted it. He would have killed Huey as he would of a snake. Louis Jones and Elaus Salk, 2 of Huey's bodyguards, remembered plots of murder. Jones was in the DeSoto room with Kristen Berry listening. We heard about the gun, Jones recalled. Judge Pavey was there. Didn't see Weiss, another bodyguard and BCI member. Frank Manning listened in and said that Oscar Wilden and Dave Haas plotted to murder Huey. Manning said that Carl Weiss made a telephone call from the DeSoto to his house in Baton Rouge. Soon after the DeSoto meeting ended, one of Huey's men phoned the details to him in Washington, where he had returned a week before. On August 9th, he took the Senate floor and waved the eavesdrop transcript high in the air. Red-faced and more animated than ever, he bared the plot to murder him. Senator Harry Truman, presiding over the Senate that day, was not convinced. Huey was crooked as a ram's horn, Truman told colleagues, and nothing but a damned demagogue. Ordering his comments printed in the Congressional Record, Huey quoted one of the conspirators as saying, "I would draw in a lottery to go out and kill Long. It would take only 1 man, 1 gun, 1 bullet." He suggested that Roosevelt may have been involved in the plot when he asked his Senate colleagues, "Does anyone doubt that President Roosevelt would pardon the man who rids the country of Huey Long?" There's a lot of plotting and speculation going around about the killing of Huey Long, or the desire to kill him. So let's get to the twilight of his life here. Saturday morning, September 7th, 1935, a week after his 42nd birthday, Huey Long called another special session in Louisiana legislature. Even though the legislators received only a few hours' notice of the 5-day session, most of them were happy to travel to Baton Rouge. They received $10 a day and 10 cents a mile to attend each session, important income during the Depression. And the frequent special sessions offer the chance to come to the capital city and get drunk. At 10 that night, Senator Jimmy No called the Senate to order with 30 of 39 senators present, while across the marble lobby, Speaker Allen Ellender counted 85 of 100 representatives at their desks. Huey already had 42 bills drafted, printed, and ready for quick passage. He had composed most of these bills himself, dictating them off the top of his head to his secretary, or, in the case of more complicated legislation, giving detailed instruction to George Wallace, his legal assistant. A week before, he ordered Wallace to draft a bill prohibiting any federal official from dispersing federal funds in Louisiana if state officials determined the action violated the powers reserved to the state under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Offenders would be sentenced to 12 months in jail. The Washington Post decried the bill, clearly aimed at Roosevelt's New Deal agents, as the broadest and boldest defiance of federal authority since the Civil War. When Wallace advised Huey that the bill was unconstitutional, the Kingfish snapped back, "I don't give a damn." He continued to tighten the noose around New Orleans, with several of his latest bills taking even more money from the city. One bill revealed his fear of violent uprising and required the registration of rifles, sawed-off shotguns, gas grenades with the BCI. All the bills passed smoothly through the Ways and Means Committee. Years before, Huey removed legislative oversight from other House committees and ordered that bills proceed only through Ways and Means, which he stacked with his most trustworthy followers. Huey ordered several bills aimed to destroy his enemies in St. Landry Parish, located about 60 miles west of Baton Rouge on the other side. St. Landry produced rich bounties of cotton, rice, sugarcane, and was the home of the proud, hot-blooded Creole families. 2 of the families, the Paveys and Garlands, had ruled parish politics since before the Civil War. The Paveys and the Garlands hated Huey, and the sheriff, Charlie Thibodeaux, fought Huey's candidates in every election. St. Landry, one of the few parishes that Huey never controlled, was a thorn in his side. "I can run hell, but I can't run St. Landry," he admitted to one of his workers. One of Huey's bills gerrymandered the St. Landry district of Judge Benjamin Pavey to ensure the judge's defeat in the 1936 election. A district judge for 28 years, Pavey earlier angered Huey when he prohibited the use of dummy commissioners in St. Landry and tried to jail Huey's poll workers. Huey vowed to destroy Pavey and ordered Wallace to draft a bill that moved the St. Landry judicial district into one that also encompassed Acadia, Lafayette, and Vermilion parishes, all long strongholds. A similar bill gerrymandered St. Landry's district attorney Lee Garland, who had held public office in the parish for 44 years. When the gerrymandering bills reached the Ways and Means Committee, the only anti-Long member of the 14 members, 23-year-old Jack Williamson from Lake Charles, objected to passing the bills without reading them. "I am told this bill takes out some of the clockwork," Huey told Williamson with a smile, "and gives the hands a chance to move." The bill passed through committee 13-1 and went to the floor for the next day's session. At the same time, Huey ordered the printing of several thousand circulars to smear Pavey and Garland. According to a New Orleans printer, Huey prepared a circular on Judge Pavey that resurrected an old rumor that Pavey's family had coffee blood in their ancestry. Supposedly, he would distribute the circulars just before the vote of the legislation that gerrymandered the judge. "Huey struck like a rattlesnake, but always warned first," a supporter recalled. Just after sunrise on September 8, 1935, Huey's bodyguards drove him from his home in New Orleans to Baton Rouge, arriving in time to attend the session that convened at 10 that morning. It was Sunday, but Huey ignored the Sabbath and kept the legislative hard at work passing his bills. September was still summer in Baton Rouge, and the cloudy, windless day turned muggy, with the mercury soaring to 95 degrees by mid-afternoon. Like recent sessions, Baton Rouge seemed quiet but tense. Extra state troopers patrolled the streets and soldiers stood guard at strategic points around the Capitol. For the first time, visitors could not observe the legislator from along the railings of the House and Senate chambers, but they were confined to the upper gallery. As Huey approached the governor's office suite in the center of the Capitol, just behind the main lobby, he passed the governor's secretary and asked, "Where is Bill Puggis?" The secretary replied that Puggis, a former anti-Long who now supported Huey, probably was home drunk. "Well, get him," Huey ordered. "We need his vote tomorrow. We have to get all our men here tomorrow." At that moment, a thin young man with black wavy hair and thick round spectacles and wearing a white linen suit stepped out from behind one of the huge marble pillars and approached Huey. "He flashed among us," remembered Fournette. "He brushed through." The man held a straw Panama hat in his left hand, and according to Fournette, who stood next to Huey, raised a small black automatic pistol in his right hand and fired only one shot into Huey's chest from about 4 feet away. Huey yelped in pain, spun around, and ran down the hallway towards the stairwell. Murphy Rodden, the bodyguard closest to Huey, lunged for the gunman, pulled his .38 Colt automatic from his holster, and shot the young man. Immediately, the other bodyguards began firing, pumping over 30 bullets into the man's lifeless body, now slumped in the corner of the corridor, with his face resting on one arm, his white suit blood-soaked and ripped to shreds. Meanwhile, as bullets ricocheted off the marble walls, Huey staggered from the scene alone, holding his hand against his side. Leaving a small trail of blood, he took the stairway down to the Capitol basement and encountered O'Connor, whom he had ordered a few minutes ago to go to the basement restaurant and buy him some cigars. "Kingfish, what's the matter?" O'Connor asked when he saw Huey staggering in the basement lobby. "Jimmy, my boy, I've been shot," Huey answered, blood trickling from his lips. O'Connor helped Huey through the door and onto the driveway outside, where he flagged down a motorist in a small Ford two-seater convertible. Holding Huey, O'Connor ordered the driver to take them to Our Lady of the Lake Hospital a few blocks away. Still upstairs at the scene of the shooting, Chick Frampton, the newspaper man waiting to interview Huey, noticed that Huey disappeared during the shooting and followed his blood-speckled trail to the basement. Learning that Huey had been driven off, Frampton took off running through the steamy Louisiana night towards the hospital. The slender young man whose dead body lay on the marble floor, riddled by dozens of bullets from Huey's bodyguards, was Carl Weiss. Retiring, scholarly, and quiet, he seemed an improbable assassin. Weiss was the 30-year-old Baton Rouge doctor, a lover of music, painting, and mathematics, a devoted husband, and father of a newborn baby. After graduating from Tulane, he studied medicine in Paris and Vienna, and then returned to Baton Rouge in 1932 to practice with his physician father as an ear, eye, and nose and throat specialist. A year later, he married Yvonne Pavey, a beautiful young woman with raven hair and luminescent blue eyes. And on June 1935, their son was born. Weiss had never met Huey. The only apparent connection between the two men was that Weiss's wife, Yvonne, was a daughter of Benjamin Pavey. The judge Huey gerrymandered from the office during the current session. Huey's accusation that Pavey's family contained coffee blood would have tainted the judge's daughter's reputation and, if aired, would have infuriated her proud young husband, Carl Weiss. Also, a few months before the shooting, Huey attacked the Pavey family when he fired Yvonne's uncle, Paul Pavey, from his job as principal of a high school, as well as her sister, Marie Pavey, from her position as third-grade teacher in Eunice. So he went to war with that family, and, obviously was gerrymandering to get the old Judge Pavey out of there, so he could get his own people in there. And like he told the one guy that, was anti-long that didn't vote on the bill, when he asked what was in the bill, he said, it's a little clockwork to get the hands moving forward. In other words, get his legislation going in these places that were staunchly anti-long or controlled by anti-long people. So there is much conspiracy around Carl Weiss and why he shot Huey, but there is definitely a lot of family connection there. At Our Lady of the Lake Hospital, a nun helped Jimmy O'Connor put Huey into a wheelchair and push him into the emergency room. Word spread quickly that Huey had been shot, and hundreds of curious spectators arrived outside the hospital. 3rd Street was just packed. You couldn't drive down it, an LSU student remembered. It was just people all over the place. Inside, dozens of Huey's followers crowded into a small emergency room, jostling with doctors and nurses trying to attend to him. Fournette, who arrived after Huey in the next car, pulled a small penknife from his pocket to cut Huey's clothes. What a scene. Here was a man dying and the room was full of politicians, recalled one observer. It was a vaudeville show, remembered another. Huey had a small puncture wound in his abdomen, just below his rib cage, and another wound on his back, near the spine, where doctors assumed the bullet exited. He was bleeding from the mouth, his blood pressure dropped, and his pulse rate soared. The doctors agreed that Huey was hemorrhaging internally, and concluded that an operation must be performed. 2 skilled surgeons in New Orleans were called, and they raced to Baton Rouge, but wrecked their car while en route and were delayed. Dr. Arthur Vidrine, a young country doctor whom Huey picked a few years earlier to head the state's charity hospital, was the ranking physician treating Huey, and decided that if an operation was not performed immediately, he would die. Dr. Cecil Loriot, a long supporter who helped overthrow the Baton Rouge police jury a year before, arrived to assist Vidrine. In New Orleans, Huey's family was spending a typical Sunday evening eating a light supper before settling down to listen to the Jack Benny Show. Rose Long took the phone call from Baton Rouge informing her of Huey's shooting. She quickly called her 3 children together and they headed for Baton Rouge. Huey's closest allies headed for the capital. Seymour Weiss in New Orleans, supervising the installation of air conditioning in the Roosevelt Hotel, also raced northward. Robert Mastry rode along with Weiss, who drove so fast that he burned up the engine in his huge Cadillac. Just after midnight, as Huey's family, Seymour Weiss, and carloads of other loyal supporters raced along the new 4-lane airline highway paralleling the Mississippi River towards Baton Rouge, doctors placed the ether cone over Huey's face and began to operate. Vidrine, talented but inexperienced, botched the operation. He opened the abdomen and suffered some internal bleeding, but did not check the kidneys or bladder for internal injury, nor did he take x-rays. Vidrine sewed Huey up after an hour-long operation, but his patient deteriorated. Still bleeding internally, probably from a damaged kidney, Huey lapsed in and out of coma. When the surgeons finally arrived from New Orleans, they recognized that they needed another operation, but decided he was too weak to undergo the trauma. 5 blood transfusions helped little. With no hope of Huey's survival, his family and few other political allies gathered at his bedside. Just after 4 on Tuesday morning, and 31 hours after being shot, Huey Long, worshipped by tens of thousands of Louisianans and despised by tens of thousands, thrashed briefly in his oxygen tent, took one last labored breath, and died. His last words were, allegedly, "God, don't let me die. I have so much to do." To many Louisianans, Huey Long was still alive. Some of his more loyal followers refused to believe he had been shot and killed. To the poor country folk, he was omnipotent and invincible, and indeed immortal. Even his enemies hesitated to believe he was dead. A few of his opponents joined the thousands of mourners standing in line at his funeral just to peer into his coffin and confirm the body was Huey's and not some imposter's. They would not have been surprised if he had played some macabre trick on them and suddenly jumped up, flailed his arms above his head, and launched into one of his tirades. Even in death, Huey's bigger-than-life personality continued to intimidate those around him. The shooting of Huey Long ignited a controversy that continues today. Many anti-Longs believed Carl Weiss did not shoot Huey and argued that Weiss went to the Capitol to rebuke him for firing his sister-in-law as a teacher. Weiss hit him on the mouth, and then when trigger-happy bodyguards began shooting Weiss, a bullet ricocheted off the marble wall and hit Huey. Others, like Fournette, Chick Frampton, and bodyguard Rodden, swore they saw Weiss pull his small black pistol and first shoot into Huey. Both supporters and enemies offered conspiracy plots suggesting Weiss did not act alone. Several, including Reverend Gerald L.K. Smith, accused President Roosevelt of having a hand in Huey's murder. For 2 days, Huey's body lay in the state at the Capitol as 80,000 mourners filed by his casket. At 4 in the afternoon on Thursday, September 12, 1935, he was buried in the sunken garden directly in front of the Capitol. The largest gathering in Louisiana history, roughly 200,000 people attended the funeral. Cars waiting to cross the Mississippi River by ferry backed up for 10 miles and hundreds of people passed out in the scorching heat. Floral tributes covered 3 acres. The LSU band with drums muffled in black satin played "Every Man a King" in a slow dirge. As spectators crowded towards the burial site, some climbing on trees to get a better view, Reverend Gerald Smith stood behind the casket and gave the funeral oration. "The blood which dropped upon our soil shall seal our hearts," he thundered out to the masses. "This place marks the resting place of Huey Long. It marks only the burial place of his body. His spirit shall never rest as long as hungry bodies cry for food, as long as human frames stand naked, as long as homeless wretches haunt this land of plenty." As he preached over Huey, old women cried and men wiped away tears. Huey's death created a huge power vacuum. While in power, he delegated little control to his underlings and left no one waiting in the wings to take over. At first, Reverend Gerald Smith tried to fill his shoes. An extraordinary orator and die-hard crusader for Share Our Wealth, Smith proved incapable of surviving the cutthroat battle that waged over control of the Long political machine. Before his death, Huey predicted that his cronies would get into trouble when he was no longer around to keep them in line. "If those fellows ever try to use the powers I gave them without me to hold them down," he told a reporter, "they'll all land in a penitentiary." He soon proved right, as Louisiana quickly deteriorated into the nation's most notorious kleptocracy. After Leach made peace with the Roosevelt administration, the New Dealers showered public work projects upon the state in exchange for guarantee of Louisiana's 20 electoral votes in the 1936 Democratic Convention. Over $100 million poured into the state between 1936 and 1939, offering lucrative opportunities for graft, kickbacks, double billing, faked specifications, and outright theft. Corruption was awash across the state. Huey's family and relatives carried on his political legacy after his death. His wife Rose completed the remaining year of his term in the U.S. Senate, where she sat in the back row next to Hattie Caraway. Alan Ellender, one of the attorneys who defended Huey during the impeachment, was elected to the Senate seat in 1936 and served until his death in 1972. Huey's brother, George Long, the dentist whom Huey lived with while studying briefly for the ministry in 1911, served in the Oklahoma State House. After moving back to Louisiana, George was elected to Congress from the 8th District, serving from 1953 until he died in 1958. Huey's cousin Gillis Long was elected to the same 8th District congressional seat, serving from 1963 to 1965 and again from 1973 to 1985. Gillis ran unsuccessfully for governor in 1963. Earl Long had a political career that was almost as colorful and controversial as his brother's Huey. In 1939, Earl, then lieutenant governor, became governor after Richard Leach was indicted and forced to resign. Defeated for re-election in 1940, Earl later ran successfully twice for governor, serving from 1948 to 52 and from 1956 to 1960. Earl took over the Long machine founded by his brother and ushered in his own brand of populism. He championed free lunch programs for school children, created a vocational school system, equalized the salaries of black and white school teachers, and fought for highway construction and old age assistance. He paid for his improvements by increasing the tax burden on New Orleans. Earl used his power as Huey to punish enemies. He tried to restrict the authority of New Orleans Mayor Chet Morrison and abolished the state civil service system to increase his own patronage. Personal troubles, including alcoholism and philandering, dogged Earl's last administration. After he made a rambling, incoherent speech to the legislature defending the voting rights of blacks, who made up a large segment of his political support, his wife Blanche committed him to an insane asylum. Still legally governor, Earl fired the asylum administrator who refused his release, and hired another administrator who pronounced him sane and discharged him. Earl ran for Congress in 1960, won the primary, but died before the general election took place. Earl's death signaled the end of 25 years of sharp division in the state between Longites and anti-Longs. In 1948, Huey's 30-year-old son, Russell, was elected to the U.S. Senate to fill the vacancy caused by the death of John Overton. Serving 38 years until his retirement in 1986, Russell became one of Washington's most powerful and respected political figures, chairing the Senate Committee on Finance and becoming an expert on taxation and revenue policy. Russell died in 2003. Although a bullet cut Huey Long's life short in 1935, his specter still plays a leading role in the melodramatic history of Louisiana politics. Many Louisianans, especially in the rural parts, revere him as a martyred champion of the common people. Indeed, a modern-day Robin Hood who took from the rich and gave to the poor. They remember Huey with awe and humor and dwell on the real improvements he brought to the state, such as roads, school books, while they ignore or minimize his brutal dictatorial methods. Each year, thousands of Louisianans travel to Baton Rouge to visit the towering state capitol that rises 450 feet above the nearby Mississippi River. Built in only a year during the worst years of the Depression, the tallest capitol in the nation could have only been created by a powerful politician of immense vision and iron-willed determination. "Build it big and build it quick," Huey once said. Today's visitors strolling about the beautifully landscaped Capitol grounds cannot miss the huge bronze statue of Huey standing 35 feet above his grave, only a few yards in front of the steps that lead into the Capitol, where he held court and, in the end, was killed. The statue does not face away from the State House to welcome visitors, as would be custom. Instead, Huey stares back eternally towards the Capitol, a determined look on his face, still appearing like he is very much in charge of all that goes on and just about to unleash a torrent of biblical phrases and foul-mouthed curses. So that is the life and times of Huey P. Long, as far as what he tangibly did for Louisiana. At his death, Louisiana had nearly 16,000 miles of paved and gravel roads and 111 bridges. In New Orleans, Long constructed a 7-mile seawall and built a modern airport, one of the nation's largest. He expanded facilities at the Charity Hospital and at Port of New Orleans and piped a cheap supply of natural gas into the city and to other population centers. Long initiated the construction of public hospitals and schools. He tripled the size of Louisiana State University, building new department facilities and a modern football stadium, as well as a new medical school. To accommodate the growing state government, Long built a new state capitol building. The Art Deco-style skyscraper was the tallest building in the South. He also built a new governor's mansion modeled after the White House. He initiated a massive adult literacy program teaching 100,000 adults to read. With free textbooks and school enrollment instantly, he gave free textbooks to all schools, and school enrollment instantly increased 20%. Long promoted higher education by expanding LSU, Louisiana State University, and even lowering the cost to attend. Despite the Depression, enrollment tripled at LSU by 1936, and it quickly became one of the finest universities in the South. Huey Long improved healthcare in Louisiana by expanding the charity hospital system, creating the Louisiana State University Medical School, reforming institutions to care for the disabled and mentally challenged, and providing free healthcare clinics and immunizations statewide. As a result, mortality rates dropped dramatically in just a few years. Through the Board of Health, Long tripled funding for public health care. The state's free health clinics grew from 10 in 1926 to 31 in 1933. Providing free immunizations to 67% of the rural population. So in a short time, he did a lot. He had to fight, scrape, and claw for it, though. Whether through bribing, bullying, or befriending, Huey found a way to consolidate power to get things done in a system that makes it very hard to get things done for the people. But Huey P. Long did find a way. That is the life and times of Huey Pierce Long.
Why we for slumber, America, land of brave and true, with castles and clothing and food for all belong to you. Every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. But there's something belonging to others, there's enough for all people to share. When it's sunny June and December too, or in the winter time or spring, there'll be peace without end, every neighbor a friend, with every man a king. There's a million sad hearts in the nation today. There's a million bowed heads hanging low. For the bravest of all had to answer the call, and our own Huey Long had to go. And with deepest regret, we will never forget, with his might he would fight every wrong. Let us all say a prayer, he's in heaven somewhere. With a sigh we say goodbye, Huey.